The bookstore smelled like wet cardboard and something sweeter underneath, maybe old glue or the particular mustiness of pages that had outlived their readers. Rowan pushed through the door more to escape the rain than out of any real interest in books, shaking water from their jacket onto the warped floorboards. The owner didn't look up from behind the counter, just kept sorting through a box of paperbacks with the resigned efficiency of someone who knew most days would end without a sale. Rowan wandered past sagging shelves of self-help manuals and celebrity memoirs, fingertips trailing along spines that left faint dust lines on their skin. In the back corner, wedged behind a stack of romance novels with shirtless men on the covers, something caught the light differently. A slim notebook, leather-bound, the kind of object that looked like it should cost more than the $5 price tag tucked into its pages suggested. Rowan pulled it free, felt the weight of it, substantial but not heavy. The leather was worn smooth in places, darker where hands had gripped it over years or decades. The pages were thick, almost parchment-like, with that faint yellow tinge that came from real age, not manufactured vintage aesthetic. What made Rowan actually look closer was the writing underneath. Not the current blank pages, but the ghost of text beneath, layers of it, like someone had written and erased the same pages over and over until the paper held the memory of words it no longer displayed. Rowan tilted the notebook to catch the fluorescent light, trying to make out shapes, but it was too faint, too confused with other layers. Inside the front cover, though, one line remained clear, written in ink that had gone brown with time. "A week is all you ever really own." It felt like the kind of profound nonsense that belonged in a fortune cookie. But there was something about the handwriting, the deliberate formation of each letter, that made it seem like a warning someone had meant. Rowan bought it for $4 after the owner agreed to knock off $1 for water damage that didn't actually exist. At home that night, still damp from the walk back, Rowan sat at their desk and opened the notebook to the first blank page. The paper was smooth under their fingers, almost soft, and their pen moved across it with less resistance than normal, the ink seeming to sink into the fibres rather than sit on top. They wrote the date at the top, Monday, April 3rd, 3 days ago. The day everything had gone spectacularly wrong. The quiz in history had been a disaster. Rowan had studied the wrong chapter, somehow convinced themselves that the test was on the Cold War when it was actually on Reconstruction, and had sat there for 40 minutes writing answers they knew were completely off base, watching the clock and feeling their grade point average crumble. Then lunch, where they'd snapped at Mara over something stupid, something about borrowed headphones and not returning them, but really about the accumulated tension of a friendship that felt lately like it was held together with fraying thread. The fight had escalated faster than either of them meant it to, and Mara had walked away mid-sentence, leaving Rowan alone at their usual table while everyone pretended not to notice. And then, because the universe apparently believed in piling on, there had been the incident in English class where Rowan had tripped over someone's backpack strap, sent their binder flying, and had to collect scattered papers while Mr. Chen paused mid-sentence, and the class watched in that particular silence that was somehow louder than laughter. Rowan wrote a different version. In this one, they studied the right chapter because they double-checked the syllabus Sunday night. The quiz was easy, or at least manageable, the kind where you finished early and felt that quiet confidence of knowing you'd done well. Lunch happened differently too. Mara brought up the headphones first, apologetically, explaining she'd left them in her gym locker, and Rowan laughed it off because in this version they weren't already wound tight from academic failure. They ate together, shared fries, made plans for the weekend. In English, Rowan's path to their desk was clear. No backpack to catch their foot, no scattered papers, no moment of exposed clumsiness in front of 26 witnesses. The writing came easily, details filling the page front and back, the ink flowing like Rowan was remembering something that had actually happened, rather than inventing something that hadn't. They signed their name at the bottom, a flourish they wouldn't normally bother with, and set the pen down. The room lurched, just a little, like a brief moment of vertigo, the floor seeming to tilt before settling. Rowan's phone buzzed on the desk, a staccato rhythm of notifications arriving all at once. They picked it up, thumbs sliding across the screen to unlock it. Texts from Mara, 3 from Monday afternoon. OMG, that quiz was so much easier than I thought. You finished before me, you nerd. Want to split loaded fries tomorrow? Another from Tuesday morning. Still thinking about that thing you said about Chen's terrible dad jokes. I'm going to crack up next time he does the Dickens voice. Rowan scrolled up, looking for the fight, the angry messages, the cold silence. Nothing. Just normal conversation. The easy back and forth of friends who hadn't spent Monday lunch hissing accusations at each other. There was a photo too, posted to their close friend story on Monday evening. Mara and Rowan at their lockers. Mara making a face at the camera. Rowan mid-laugh in the background. Rowan didn't remember that photo. Didn't remember the moment, the context, what had been funny. They opened their school portal, hands not quite steady. The history quiz grade was posted, 87% B+. Not perfect, but solid, respectable. The kind of grade that didn't drag down an average or require explaining to parents. Rowan sat very still, staring at the notebook. The ink of their signature had dried darker than the rest of the text, almost black against the faint yellow of the page. Around the edges of what they'd written, those ghost layers of the old handwriting seemed more visible now. Or maybe it was just the angle of the desk lamp, the way the light caught the texture of the paper. Later, getting a glass of water in the kitchen, Rowan paused at the fridge. There was a photo held up with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Rowan at maybe 7 or 8, gap-toothed and sunburned, standing in front of a playground. Their old elementary school, Oakwood. Rowan knew that, could remember the name, the general location, the fact that they'd gone there from kindergarten through 5th grade. But the specifics, what had the playground actually looked like? There had been a slide, red or blue or yellow, the colour wouldn't quite solidify in their mind. A mural on the wall of the building painted by some artist who'd visited. Something with animals or maybe trees or possibly both, but the image was blurry, like trying to remember a dream hours after waking. The layout of the equipment, where the swings were in relation to the basketball court, whether there had been monkey bars or a climbing wall or both, it was all fuzzy, indistinct, like someone had smudged the photograph of their memory. Rowan shook their head, blamed it on being tired, and went back to their room. Over the next 3 days they experimented, carefully at first, just small things. Tuesday had featured a clumsy conversation with Jordan, the person Rowan had been halfway crushing on since September, an interaction in the library that had involved a lot of stuttering and an accidentally knocked over pencil case. Rowan titled a page Tuesday, April Ford and wrote it smoother. Coherent sentences, a shared laugh over a terrible pun, Jordan writing their number on Rowan's hand in blue pen. They filled the page, signed it, felt that small lurch again. Their phone showed a text from an unknown number sent Tuesday evening. Hey, it's Jordan, in case the pen washed off. Wednesday's cafeteria incident, slipping on something wet, catching themselves on a table edge but still drawing attention and scattered applause from the jackass table by the windows, got rewritten into a non-event, just a normal lunch where nothing went wrong. Another page, another signature, another lurch. And with it, another memory going soft around the edges. Rowan's grandmother's voice, the specific cadence of how she said Rowan's name, the accent that revealed her childhood in a different country, the warm rough texture of her hands. All of it dimmer now, like someone had turned down the brightness and contrast, leaving just the knowledge that she'd existed, that she'd been important, without the sensory details that made her real. The pattern became clear through trial and error. To change a day within the last week, you wrote a continuous entry titled with that date. Front and back of a page, no stopping, no crossing out, no gaps in the narrative. Then you signed your name. The world would shift, would bend reality to accommodate what was written, not through impossible magic but through subtle alterations, conversations that went differently, timing that changed, choices that diverged. People still acted like themselves. The notebook couldn't turn someone cruel into someone kind, but circumstances aligned. Words came out better, disasters were avoided, and every time something older vanished or thinned. A memory with no connection to the rewritten day. Something from years past would lose resolution. The smell of their grandfather's garage, oil and sawdust and something metallic. The exact way their childhood dog Pepper had barked. The particular pitch and rhythm of it. The layout of the apartment they'd lived in before their parents' divorce. Which rooms connected to which, where the kitchen window had looked out. The memories weren't completely erased at first. Rowan knew these things had existed, could cite them as facts, but the emotional weight, the sensory details, the feeling of actually having experienced them, that leaked away like water through cupped hands. Rowan also discovered that reversal was possible but difficult. Taking a blank page, titling it with a date already rewritten, and describing what had actually happened in complete truthful detail, front to back, then signing, that could restore the original timeline. But it required accuracy, and once a day had been rewritten, remembering the original version became harder. People's behaviours in the new timeline created new memories, new reference points. Trying to reconstruct what had really happened was like trying to reassemble a sandcastle after the tide had come through. By the end of that first week, Rowan's days were objectively better. The quiz grade was solid, no cafeteria humiliation, things with Jordan were promising, Mara was a constant supportive presence. But Rowan would catch themselves mid-thought, reaching for a memory that should have been there and finding only fog, their grandmother's favourite song, the name of their first best friend from preschool, the plot of the movie they'd watched 100 times as a kid, the one that had made them feel safe during their parents' worst fights. Gone. All of it. Or so faded it might as well be. The notebook itself seemed to darken with use. Those ghost layers of old writing beneath Rowan's entries became more visible, pressed up against the current text like they were trying to surface. Squinting at them in good light, Rowan could sometimes make out partial dates, fragments of sentences in different hands. Someone else had used this notebook, multiple someone else's over years or decades, writing and rewriting and writing again until the pages held the memory of a dozen lives. When everything went completely wrong, it was a Thursday, 2 weeks after Rowan had found the notebook. Their younger sibling Casey, 11 years old and convinced they were invincible on a bicycle, took a corner too fast on the way home from school and collided with a parked car. The call came while Rowan was in calculus, their dad pulling them out of class with a face that made Rowan's stomach drop before any words were said. Casey was at the hospital with a broken arm, fractured collarbone, and a concussion that had the doctors watching closely for swelling. Rowan sat in the waiting room while Casey was examined, while their parents spoke in low, urgent voices with doctors, while the afternoon stretched into evening. Casey would be okay probably, but the probably was doing terrible things to Rowan's ability to think about anything else. Their little sibling, who'd been annoying them about a video game that morning, who'd stolen the last of the good cereal, who was supposed to be invincible because they were 11, and nothing truly bad was supposed to happen yet. That night, home finally. Casey asleep in their room with their mother camped out in a chair by the bed. Rowan opened the notebook, titled a page, Thursday, April 13th, wrote a version where Casey took the turn slower, where the timing was off by 30 seconds so the bike path was clear, where they arrived home with nothing worse than homework complaints. Rowan wrote carefully, mapped out every part of the afternoon they could think of, made sure Casey was safe in every version of every event. Front and back, no gaps, signed at the bottom. The lurch was bigger this time, lasted longer, made Rowan grip the edge of their desk. When it passed, the house was quieter. Rowan walked to Casey's room, pushed the door open slowly. Casey was at their desk, hunched over homework, left arm moving normally, no cast, no sling. They looked up when Rowan entered. "You need something?" "No, just checking on you." "Weird, but okay." Casey turned back to their math worksheet. Perfectly fine, perfectly whole. The afternoon's disaster erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Rowan went back to their room and opened their phone, looking for the photographs their dad had texted from the hospital, the updates on Casey's condition. Nothing. The text thread was mundane. Stuck in traffic, starting dinner without me from earlier in the week, a reminder about a dentist appointment, a question about whether Rowan had finished the college application essay. No emergency, no hospital, no Casey in a paper gown with a white cast and frightened eyes. But something else was gone too. Something bigger. There were photos on Rowan's phone from a trip 2 years ago. Their dad and Rowan driving up the coast over spring break, just the two of them. Rowan knew this had happened. Could see the pictures. Roadside diners, a beach with black sand, themselves grinning in front of an enormous redwood tree. But they couldn't remember being there. Couldn't recall the conversations in the car, the feeling of the trip, why they'd gone, what they'd talked about. The photos looked like pictures from someone else's vacation, interesting images of a stranger who happened to look like them. Rowan's hands were shaking. They closed the notebook, shoved it to the back of their desk drawer, tried to convince themselves they wouldn't use it again. That resolution lasted 3 days before Mara announced she was done. They were at Mara's house, supposedly studying for the physics exam, but really they'd been talking, and the conversation had drifted into territory Rowan should have known to avoid. Mara had been mentioning more and more lately how things felt off, how Rowan seemed different, distant, like they weren't fully present even when they were sitting right there. And Rowan, tired and rattled and still reeling from the cost of saving Casey, had gotten defensive. Words were said, the kind that couldn't be unsaid, implications about who needed who more, about whose problems were actually worth worrying about. Mara stood up from her bed, closed the physics textbook with a decisive thump. "I think you should go." "Mara, come on, I didn't mean—" "I know exactly what you meant. We're done, Rowan, I can't keep doing this." The door closed behind Rowan with a quiet click that felt final. At home, Rowan didn't hesitate, didn't try to talk themselves out of it. Open the notebook to a fresh page. Monday, April 17th. The fight had happened today, Monday evening, which meant it was still within the 7-day window. Rowan wrote it differently. The conversation staying light. Physics problems actually getting solved. A discussion about summer plans instead of accusations about emotional availability. They wrote Mara laughing, making plans for the weekend, the evening ending with a hug, and promises to text later. Page front and back, every detail, signature at the bottom with extra force. The lurch, the shift, the settling of a new reality. Rowan's phone showed texts from Mara, sent an hour ago. "I still don't understand kinetic energy, but at least we tried. Hey, you forgot your calculator here. Want to see that new horror movie Saturday?" But the cost this time was massive. Rowan sat at their desk, trying to remember the family trip from 4 years ago, the one they'd taken the summer before high school, all 4 of them together before the divorce really took hold. They knew it had happened, could see their mother's Facebook photos from it, tagged locations in national parks, captions about family bonding and making memories. But trying to pull up any actual memory from that trip was like reaching into empty space. Where had they gone? Mountains or coast? What had they done? Had it been fun or tense? Had Casey been 7 or 8? The photos showed events Rowan had apparently participated in. There they were, in shot after shot, but it felt like looking at a well-documented stranger's vacation. Rowan found Mara the next day at lunch, slid into the seat across from her with a relief so intense it made their hands unsteady. Mara looked up from her sandwich, smiled easily. "Hey, you find your calculator?" "Yeah, thanks." Rowan hadn't lost a calculator, had never left one at Mara's house in the current timeline, but the lie came automatically. "Mara, can I ask you something weird?" "You always do." "Do you ever feel like things aren't quite right? Like the week has been... off?" Mara tilted her head, considering. "Off how?" "Like, do you remember us fighting yesterday?" "Yesterday? We study physics at my place. You were in a weird mood, but we didn't fight. Why, did you think we were going to?" "No, it's just... never mind. Forget it." But Mara was watching Rowan more closely now, a small line forming between her eyebrows. "You've been strange lately, you know that. Not in a bad way, just... I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're out of sync with everything else." Rowan wanted to explain. Wanted to pull out the notebook right there in the cafeteria and show Mara everything. Make her understand why things felt off. Why Rowan sometimes responded to conversations they didn't remember having. Why they occasionally looked confused by inside jokes that apparently only existed in the current version of reality. But how did you explain that you'd been rewriting the world? That the past 2 weeks were a palimpsest of better outcomes built on top of erased disasters? That the foundation of your entire life was being quietly removed one old memory at a time? "I know," Rowan said finally. "I'm working on it." Over the next week, Rowan kept using the notebook. Not compulsively, they told themselves. Just when it mattered. A college interview that went badly, rewritten into success. A family dinner that devolved into arguments about money and whose fault the divorce had been. Smoothed into civil conversation and passing bowls of pasta. An audition for the spring musical that had been a disaster of forgotten lines and pitchy notes, transformed into a confident performance that earned a callback. Each time, the trade. Older memories losing colour, losing weight, losing truth. Rowan's first day of middle school. the moment they realised they loved playing guitar. The funeral for their grandmother, which they knew had happened, which they knew had been important and sad, but which now felt like a historical fact rather than a lived experience. The first time they understood their parents were going to divorce. Casey's first words, their own first words, family legend repeated in stories they could no longer feel the truth of. And the timeline itself was scrambling. Events from years past were still factually correct. Rowan could cite dates, confirm details against external records, but the emotional sequence was wrong. A minor embarrassment from 8th grade felt as vivid and significant as the day their grandmother died. The time. They'd gotten lost at a theme park at age 6 carried the same weight as the conversation where their father had moved out. The first time Jordan had smiled at them in the hallway felt more important than the entire summer they'd spent learning to swim. Rowan was building an optimised present on top of a past that was not only hollow but reordered. Priorities shuffled like someone had taken their entire childhood and adolescence and arranged them by the wrong metric. Mara became an anchor without meaning to. She kept detailed planners, voice memos to herself about the day's events, texts that referenced specific conversations and moments. As Rowan rewrote more of the current week, the disconnect between Mara's careful records and Rowan's reshaped reality grew. Mara would reference something Rowan had said that Rowan didn't remember saying, would bring up plans they'd apparently made that didn't exist in Rowan's memory of how the week had gone originally. The dissonance was small enough to hide, but Rowan could feel it widening, a growing gap between the world as others experienced it and the world as Rowan was crafting it. One evening, unable to keep it in any longer, Rowan tried to explain. They were at the park near Mara's house, sitting on swings that hadn't been designed for teenagers but worked well enough. The light was going golden, the temperature dropping, and Rowan heard themselves saying things that sounded unhinged even as they said them. It's like living in a house where someone keeps repainting the walls but the foundation is being removed. Everything looks better but it feels thinner. Does that make sense? Mara pushed herself gently back and forth, the chains of the swing creaking. Not really, but I believe that it feels that way to you. Things are better now, objectively better. Grades are good, I'm not embarrassing myself constantly. Jordan actually likes me, you and I haven't fought in weeks. But I can't remember what my grandmother's voice sounded like. I know I went on this trip with my dad, but I can't remember any of it. There's a photo of me in elementary school and I can't tell you what the playground looked like. Maybe you're just stressed. College applications, school, everything. It's a lot. Maybe. But Rowan knew it wasn't stress. Knew exactly what was causing the holes, the reordering, the sense of living a life that was technically theirs but emotionally belonged to someone else. That night, Rowan examined the notebook more carefully. In good light, with patience, those ghost layers of old writing could be partially deciphered. Different handwriting, different inks, different dates stretching back decades. One section, about 2/3 through the notebook, was dense with text in a cramped collegiate hand. Rowan could make out fragments. November 14th, rewrite the breakup. November 15th, fix the exam. November 18th, undo the call home. Then later entries, more desperate. November 14th again, write it exactly. As it was, she said she needed space, not that she hated me. We were at the coffee shop, not the library. Attempts to restore, to undo, to get back to the original version. And then, near what must have been the end of that person's use, pages of text that barely made sense, words becoming disconnected, sentences fragmenting, like someone trying to write coherently while their grasp on sequence and meaning was falling apart. The last clear line in that section. I can't remember which version was real. Rowan closed the notebook, hands cold. The breaking point came when Rowan tried to undo one of the earlier rewrites. They wanted back the day of the history quiz, the fight with Mara, the stumble in English class. Wanted to prove to themselves they could restore something, could reverse the cost, could get back at least one piece of authentic past, even if it was painful. They took a blank page, titled it Monday, April 3rd, and tried to write exactly what had actually happened. But the details were gone. Rowan knew there had been a quiz. That was a fact. But had it been multiple choice or essay? What specific questions had tripped them up? The fight with Mara? What exact words had been said? What had started it? The headphones or something earlier? Had Rowan been the one to walk away first, or Mara? In what order had things happened? Morning classes, then lunch, then the stumble, or had the stumble been first? Had their dad made dinner that night? Or had they ordered pizza? Or had Rowan just eaten cereal alone in their room? Rowan sat over the blank page for an hour, pen hovering, trying to reconstruct something they could no longer clearly see. Every version they started to write felt like it could be right, but also could be wrong. Another alteration, another layer of false text on top of already obscured truth. Without accurate memory, any attempt to restore the original was just creating another rewritten version, another permutation, another coat of paint over foundations that were no longer there. They were trapped, stuck in a week that was objectively better, good grades, intact friendships, no humiliations, no disasters, but built on top of a past that had been gutted and reordered until Rowan couldn't trust their own memory of who they'd been, or what had mattered, or what had made them themselves. Rowan found Mara the next morning before first period, pulled her into an empty classroom and showed her the notebook. Explained everything. The rewrites, the cost, the way the last 2 weeks had been systematically optimised while Rowan's childhood and early adolescence were being erased or scrambled. Mara listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions, scepticism, concern, something that might have been belief or might have been worry about Rowan's mental state. When Rowan finished, Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Show me my planner." Rowan handed it over, watched Mara flip through pages of her own careful, handwriting, detailed accounts of each day, times and events and snippets of conversation. Mara compared her entries to Rowan's descriptions of what had actually happened, the original versions before rewrites. The discrepancies were obvious. Days where Mara's planner showed smooth sailing while Rowan described disasters, events that Mara had recorded in detail that Rowan claimed had never happened in the first version. "Okay," Mara said finally. "I don't know if I fully understand this, but I believe something is happening, and I believe you need to stop. I have stopped. Mostly, you need to actually stop, and you need to try to get back at least one real day, even if it was bad. Something you can be sure actually happened." That evening, Mara came over with her planner, her phone full of screenshots and voice memos, her laptop with calendar entries and photos. They spread everything out on Rowan's bed. A map of the last 3 weeks according to someone who hadn't been rewriting reality, who'd just been living through it in linear time. Mara walked Rowan through each day, reading entries, playing audio notes to herself, showing texts that referenced specific moments. "Here," Mara said, pointing to an entry from late April. "This was the day you said something in the car about feeling like you were watching your own life from outside. I made a note because it seemed important. You were quiet all day after that." Rowan didn't remember that conversation, didn't remember the car ride or the feeling or saying anything like that. But they could see it in Mara's neat handwriting, dated and timed, a record of something that had apparently mattered enough for Mara to write down. They chose a day, Friday, April 21st, just 3 days ago, a day that Rowan had rewritten twice, first to smooth over a disaster of a physics lab where they'd somehow managed to break expensive equipment, then again when that rewrite had caused different problems with the lab partners. Mara's records showed the original version, Rowan dropping a digital scale, the crack of breaking glass, the teacher's disappointed face, the rest of the lab period spent cleaning up and apologising. Embarrassing, grade-lowering, the kind of moment that stuck with you, but real. Something that had happened to Rowan, not to an optimised version they'd scripted. Using Mara's detailed records, Rowan reconstructed the day as exactly as possible. The physics disaster went first, described in full awkward detail. Then lunch, where Rowan had been too upset about the lab to eat much and had vented to Mara about being clumsy and useless. English class, where they'd been so distracted they'd barely heard the discussion. Walking home in rain, arriving damp and frustrated, snapping at Casey over something trivial, hiding in their room until dinner. All of it painful, all of it imperfect, none of it the kind of day anyone would choose to preserve. But it was the truth. The actual thing that had happened before Rowan had decided it was worth trading old memories to erase it. Rowan filled the page, front and back, signed their name at the bottom. The lurch came, stronger than usual. Or maybe it just felt stronger because this time Rowan was choosing to make things worse, choosing to put back a disaster they'd already fixed. The room settled. Rowan's phone showed texts from that Friday. Mara sending sympathy about the physics lab, making jokes to try to lighten the mood, suggesting they study together over the weekend to prepare for the next lab. A photo from that day, taken by Casey through Rowan's bedroom door. Rowan at their desk, head in hands, looking defeated. But something else came back too. Not completely, not perfectly, but warmer than before. The memory of their grandmother's voice, the specific way she'd said Rowan's full name when she was trying to get their attention, the accent, the warmth. Not all the details, not the full weight of it, but enough to feel real again, enough to remember having loved her rather than just knowing it as a fact. Rowan closed the notebook and looked at Mara, who was watching with the careful attention of someone witnessing something they didn't fully understand but recognised as important. "Did it work?" Mara asked. "I broke the scale again," Rowan said, and found they were almost laughing. "I'm back to being clumsy and terrible at physics." "Good. You were always terrible at physics. It's part of your charm." Over the next week, Rowan didn't open the notebook. It sat in the desk drawer, leather cover smooth and dark, pages full of rewrites and attempts and the ghost layers of previous owners who'd made the same bargain, trading depth for polish, past for present, truth for optimization. Rowan could feel the temptation every time something went wrong. A conversation with Jordan that was more awkward than they'd hoped. A calculus test that kicked their arse. A family dinner where the tension was thick enough to choke on. The notebook was right there, offering the chance to smooth it all over, to make this week perfect, to never have to live with the consequences of being clumsy or inarticulate, or just ordinarily imperfect. But Rowan remembered the previous owner's last words, visible beneath layers of other text. I can't remember which version was real. Remembered the feeling of looking at photos from their own childhood and seeing a stranger. Remembered trying to recall their grandmother's voice and finding nothing but fog. Some of the rewrites couldn't be undone. Some days would remain in their optimized versions, emotionally lighter, less real. Some memories from further back were gone entirely, or so scrambled in importance that Rowan could no longer trust what had actually mattered and what hadn't. The foundation of their past was full of holes now, walls repainted so many times the original structure was unclear. But Rowan could stop here, could refuse to trade any more authentic memory for scripted perfection, could learn to live in a present they earned rather than one they wrote. On a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, Rowan wrapped the notebook in plain brown paper, sealed it with tape, and wrote across the front in large letters, "This book steals your real life slowly." Added below smaller, "You can rewrite your days, but you lose your years. Not worth it. Don't use it." They packed it in a box with bubble wrap, addressed it to the University Library's Special Collections Department, with a note saying it was a historical artifact that should be archived and sealed, not circulated. Then Rowan went to the drugstore and bought a normal spiral notebook, the cheap kind with a cardboard cover, and brought it home. Sat at their desk that evening and wrote about their day in all its flawed, unedited reality. The calculus test they'd probably failed. The conversation with Jordan that had been awkward in some moments, nice in others, ultimately just human and imperfect. Dinner where their dad had made pasta and the sauce was too salty but everyone ate it anyway. Casey showing them a drawing from art class. Texting with Mara about nothing important. The writing wouldn't change anything, wouldn't reshape the day, wouldn't smooth over the rough parts, wouldn't trade future memory for present perfection. It was just a record, ordinary and honest, the kind of thing you wrote to help yourself remember rather than to rewrite what you'd want to forget. Rowan signed their name at the bottom, not as a magical seal, but just as proof. This happened. This was real. This was mine. Outside, the evening was settling into night, and somewhere in a mailbox the leather notebook waited to be collected and delivered and locked away, where it could be studied but not used. Rowan closed their cheap spiral notebook, set it on the desk next to the lamp, and felt the particular relief of knowing that tomorrow would happen once, in whatever messy way it happened, and that they'd have to live with it. The future would be earned the hard way, one unedited day at a time, but at least it would be theirs. Incomplete, but authentic. Imperfect, but real. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The storm hit on a Tuesday, shrieking in from the northeast with the kind of fury that made even Grandad Owen, who'd spent 40 years as lightkeeper, pull the curtains and turn up the radio. By Wednesday morning the harbour looked scoured clean. Boats that had been swaying gently at their moorings now sat askew, lines tangled, one dinghy beached halfway up the public steps. Marin found her father already down at the shop, assessing damage to the hull of Mrs. Chen's sailboat. "Could have been worse," he said, running his hand along a fresh gouge. "Jetty took the worst of it." Marin walked out along the breakwater after helping him secure loose tools. The old lighthouse rose behind her, its lamp long since automated, Grandad's cottage at its base looking small against the grey sky. The jetty stones were slick with kelp and smelled of salt and diesel, but something caught the morning light differently than it had before. Where algae had crusted the rocks for as long as Marin could remember, the storm had scrubbed them nearly bare. And there, just below the high tide line, was brass. She crouched, tracing the metal with one finger. It was a disc, maybe 2 feet across, bolted directly into the jetty stones. Concentric rings were engraved with tiny figures. Constellations, she realised, her heart quickening. Orion, the Pleiades, Cassiopeia. Each constellation sat in its own segment, arranged around a central pin that looked like it could rotate. A single line was etched deep across the diameter, pointing north. Words in old script ran along the outer rim, as above, so below, let tide keep true. "Jules is going to lose his mind," she said aloud. She took photos from every angle as the tide crept in, then texted her best friend. By the time the water covered the disc completely, Jules was already biking down from his house on the hill, his drone case strapped to his back. "An astrarium," Jules said that evening, both of them perched on the jetty as the tide pulled back again. "But why bolt it into a breakwater? These things were for calculating planetary positions, not... Look." Marin pointed to a small notch in the outer ring, now exposed as the water receded. "There's a mechanism. I think it only engages when the tide hits a certain height." Jules leaned closer, his headlamp illuminating the intricate gearing. "Low tide, has to be. When was the last midnight low?" Marin pulled up her tide app. "Tonight, in about 4 hours." They brought Grandad Owen down at 11:30, the old man moving carefully over the uneven stones. He stood looking at the brass disc for a long time, saying nothing, while Marin and Jules waited. "Your grandmother," he finally said, "used to tell me the jetty remembered where it used to be. I thought she meant metaphorically." He touched the central pin, then withdrew his hand. "Be careful what you align, Marin. The coast and the charts don't always agree, and there's usually a reason." "You knew this was here?" "Suspected. Never had the courage to look," he squeezed her shoulder. "Low tide's in 20 minutes. I'll wait up at the cottage. If you're not back by dawn, I'm calling the Coast Guard. Magic or no magic." The tide retreated, leaving shallow puddles on the flat stones around the astrarium. Marin lay on her stomach, checking her star app, then looking up at the November sky. Orion hung low in the east, brilliant even with the harbour lights. She could see his reflection in the largest puddle, wavering slightly. "Okay," she said. "If I rotate this so Orion on the disc matches Orion in the puddle..." "You're going to try it? Right now?" Jules grabbed his phone. "At least let me get the GPS coordinates locked first." She waited while he fussed with settings, her hand on the central pin. It moved smoothly when she pulled it up, releasing the rings. The brass felt warm despite the cold air. Slowly she rotated the disc, watching the tiny engraved Orion turn to align with the reflection below. Cassiopeia next, the Pleiades. One by one, the constellations matched their watery mirrors. "Marin, the meridian line has to point north when you..." The first small wave of the incoming tide crossed the engraved line. The world tilted. Marin's stomach dropped like she'd missed a step in the dark. Sound muffled, then roared back, but different. The electric hum of the harbour lights was gone. In its place, the slap of water against wood, the creak of rope and voices distant but clear, speaking in the particular careful way of people working at night. She looked up. Oil lamps hung on posts along the shore. The lighthouse beam swept the harbour, but slower than she was used to, more golden. Her father's boat shop wasn't there. Instead, rough scaffolding marked where the jetty met the land, and men in dark coats were hauling stones into position. "Jules!" Her voice came out wrong, too loud, panicked. But Jules wasn't there. She was alone on the jetty, the brass disc under her hands still warm. The date in her mind, it had to be. She looked at the constellation pattern. tried to remember which years matched this configuration. Late 1800s, 1880s maybe. The realization hit her like cold water. She was there. Actually there. A man appeared on the jetty behind her, carrying a shuttered lantern. "You there? This is a construction site. What's your—" He stopped, taking in her jeans, her waterproof jacket, her LED headlamp. "What in God's name are you wearing?" Marin scrambled backward, nearly slipping. Her hands found the astrarium, and she did the only thing she could think of. She checked her star app. No signal, useless, and tried to remember what the sky looked like from her own time 4 hours ago. She rotated the disk frantically, approximating, guessing. Orion higher, Cassiopeia more to the west. The central pin clicked. She held her breath as another wave crossed the meridian line. The tilt, the drop, the roar. She was back. Jules was still bent. Over his phone, fingers frozen mid-swipe. He looked up. "Did you feel—" "I went back." The words tumbled out. "Jules, I went back. There was someone there. And the lighthouse. It was real. It was—" "Back where?" But his GPS was showing an error. "That's weird. The coordinates are off by like 15 centimetres. Let me recalibrate." They found the discrepancy in the morning light. The mooring ring that Mrs. Chen had been complaining was too far from her usual dock position. Marin had tied boats to it 100 times, always a good metre clear of the jetty edge, was now half embedded in the stones, as if the rock had grown around it. "Sensor error," Jules said, but he didn't sound convinced. Marin touched the brass disc, already disappearing again under the rising tide. "We changed something. Coming back, I mean. We changed where the jetty thinks it should be." They tested it carefully over the next 2 weeks, making small jumps. Just an hour back, then 2, then a few years. Each time Marin aligned the astrarium to match a past sky, she'd slip into that night, stay for minutes, then realign to return. And each time, something small would shift. A ladder no longer quite reached the water. The angle of the boat ramp seemed steeper. Jules started keeping obsessive overlays, comparing historical harbour surveys with current measurements, and the maps began to disagree with themselves in ways that made him mutter about subduction and sediment load, until Marin reminded him they were using a magic brass disc, not geology. The first time they encountered Harbour Master Huxley properly was on a jump back to September 1882. Marin had gotten better at navigating the past, bringing a period-appropriate coat and pinning her hair back. Huxley was a compact man with magnificent sideburns and a surveyor's eye, standing on the jetty with a notebook sketching sight lines. "The current," he was saying to a worker, "comes through at the wrong angle. We'll place stone here, here and here." His pencil stabbed the air. "To redirect it. The harbour must be perfected." Marin watched him work through 3 visits, always from a distance. He was methodical, obsessive, piling rocks and driving pilings according to some internal vision of harbour perfection that didn't quite match the water's preferences. And when she returned each time, Jules would show her new discrepancies. The erosion pattern on the south beach had changed. The channel markers had to be repositioned. The harbour was being redrawn, night by night, trip by trip. In the present day, Ms. Corbett arrived with rolled plans and a laptop full of simulations. The coastal engineer spread her designs across the community centre table, while the Harbour Commission leaned in. A new seawall, an expanded marina, all of it backed by models showing storm surge projections, erosion rates, economic impact. "The current configuration," Corbett said, laser pointer dancing across cross-sections, "leaves us vulnerable. My modelling shows that with strategic hardening here and here, we reduce flood risk by 40%. Marin stood at the back of the room with her father. She could see the problem immediately. Corbett's baseline maps didn't match the harbour anymore. The channel was slightly wider than her model showed. The beach access was in a different spot. Small changes, but they would compound. The seawall would be built for a harbour that no longer existed. "We need to stop," Marin told Jules that night. They were at the lighthouse cottage, Grandad Owen pouring tea while Jules spread his latest overlay across the kitchen table. "Look at this accumulation," Jules said. 15 trips and we've shifted the harbour mouth almost a metre northwest. Do you know what that does to current patterns? To sediment deposition? Which is exactly why we could fix it." Jules looked up. his eyes bright with that particular intensity that meant he'd been thinking about something for hours. Not stop, fix it. We've been random, but what if we were precise? We've got every harbour survey ever done. We can calculate the most stable configuration, the one that's safest and keeps everything people need. Then we make one big trip, adjust the past and lock it in. Grandad Owen set down his mug. And if you get it wrong, then we try. No! The old man's voice was sharp. You don't get to try again. Every change costs something. You've already moved things that people rely on. What happens when you shift something that puts a boat on rocks, or a house in a flood zone? Marin felt the weight of it settle on her chest. But Corbett's seawall will be worse. She's designing for a harbour that doesn't exist anymore because we changed it, and if we don't fix what we broke... So fix it, Grandad Owen said, but carefully and finally, because a place isn't a puzzle you can solve. It's alive, it changes, and you need to let it rest. They worked for 3 days straight. Jules compiled every historical map, every survey, every photograph. He built a composite that showed where the harbour had been most stable across centuries, which configurations had weathered storms best, where natural currents wanted to flow. Marin charted which changes in the past would create which outcomes in the present, tracing chains of cause and effect through Huxley's obsessive notebooks that she'd photographed on her trips. The plan was delicate. One trip to one specific night in 1883. They would intercept Huxley before his most aggressive intervention, a massive stone revetment he'd placed to block what he called a troublesome side current, but that Jules's data showed was actually essential for flushing sediment. They'd convince him to leave it alone, to place just one carefully positioned barrier instead, and let nature handle the rest. Then Marin would realign the astrarium to match the current night sky exactly, locking the harbour into this new old configuration. It'll protect from floods, Jules said, pointing to his models, keep the boatyard viable, preserve beach access, and it matches the most stable historical average by like 92%. And Corbett's seawall? Won't be necessary, or at least her models will show different results, and maybe she'll design something that actually fits. The night they chose was cold and clear, the kind of November midnight where stars seem close enough to touch. Marin came prepared with careful notes, star charts, and a speech for Huxley that she'd practiced until her father asked if she was rehearsing for a play. Jules would stay in the present, watching his GPS coordinates, ready to document the change. She aligned the disk, matching the past sky pattern ring by ring. The meridian line gleamed in her headlamp. The wave crossed it. The drop. The tilt. The arrival. 1883 smelled of coal smoke and fish and wet stone. Huxley was exactly where Jules's research said he'd be, standing with 2 workers beside a growing pile of rocks. His lantern cast sharp shadows. "Harbour Master," Marin called, trying to make her voice confident. He turned, and she saw him clock her strange clothes, her impossible presence, but he was a practical man. "You're from the lighthouse?" "Sort of. I need to talk to you about the revetment. It's essential. The current is essential too." She pulled out Jules' printed diagrams, anachronistic and obvious, but Huxley was already reaching for them. "The side current flushes sediment. If you block it completely, you'll create a dead zone that fills in. But if you place just this one barrier, here," she pointed, "you'll redirect the problematic surge without killing the flow." He studied the papers, his finger tracing the flow lines. "These are remarkably detailed. How did you—" "I've seen what happens if you don't," Marin said. "Please, just this one change. Let the harbour be what it wants to be." Huxley looked at her for a long moment, then at his men, then at the stone pile. One barrier, precisely positioned. "Precisely," Marin agreed. She helped them place it, though the workers gave her baffled looks. It took 2 hours. When it was done, Huxley made her mark it on his charts, committing to the change in his meticulous hand. Then she walked back to the jetty. The sky was changing. Real clouds rolling in from the west, occluding stars. Marin felt panic spike. She needed clear sky to align the astrarium properly, to match tonight's configuration back in 2025. She pulled out her notes, her star app useless across the temporal gap, and tried to remember. Orion at this angle. Cassiopeia there. The Pleiades, where were they behind the clouds? She made her best guess, rotating the rings, her hands shaking. Back in the present, Jules was watching his screen. Corbett had spent the day staking out preliminary markers for the seawall, working from her models. If this didn't work, the Commission would vote tomorrow on a design that no longer matched reality. On the jetty in 1883, Marin locked the pin. She could hear the tide rushing in louder than before. One clean wave, that's what she needed. One smooth surge to cover the disk completely. The clouds broke just enough for her to see Orion's belt, and she made one last tiny adjustment. The wave came, it crossed the meridian line and flooded the brass disc in one motion. The world yanked her home. Marin landed hard on the present-day jetty, gasping. Jules was there immediately, grabbing her arm. "Are you okay? You were gone for... How long were you gone?" "Hours, Jules, the clouds, I had to guess. Look," he held up his phone. The harbour spread below them, and it was different. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The channel was wider, cleaner. The boat shop sat properly against the water, the dock a functional length. The public steps curved down to a beach that looked slightly different but completely usable. And on Jules's screen, his GPS overlay was settling, coordinates stabilising into a configuration that matched. Marin pulled out her phone, multiple historical surveys all at once. "It averaged," Jules breathed. "The changes propagated and averaged into a composite. Look, this matches the 1891 survey and the 1947 survey and the stable period in the 80s. We made a compromise shape." They scrambled up to the harbour office where Corbett was working late, her laptop open. She was frowning at her screen, running simulations again. "That's odd," she was saying to her assistant. "The erosion patterns are showing completely different." She looked up as Marin and Jules appeared in the doorway. "Can I help you?" "Your seawall design," Marin said. "You'll want to check your baseline data. I think the harbour's been surveyed more recently than you're accounting for." Corbett pulled up her models, compared them to fresh measurements her team had taken that afternoon. Her frown deepened. "These don't match at all. The entire channel geometry is..." She grabbed her phone. "We're going to need to resurvey before the Commission vote. These projections are wrong." Over the next week, Marin watched the harbour settle. Small daily changes still happened, tides shifted sand, storms moved rocks. But the big jump stopped. The shoreline stabilised into its new shape, and Jules's obsessive measurements confirmed what Marin could feel. It was done. The harbour had found a configuration it wanted to keep, one that echoed multiple pasts and created a more stable future. Corbett came back with new designs, smaller, adaptive. "Working with the natural currents instead of against them," she explained to the Commission. "My initial models were too aggressive. This approach is more resilient." The vote passed, but it was for something different than she'd originally planned. Something that fit the harbour as it was now, not as it had been or might have been. Grandad Owen found Marin at the lighthouse cottage one evening, both of them looking down at the jetty. The brass disc was visible at low tide, gleaming. "You did well," he said. "But you're done now. Yes?" "Yes," Marin said. She meant it. "Your grandmother told me once that the old keepers felt the jetty move. Little shifts, generation to generation. I wonder if they had the same choice you did, and if they made it. Did they choose right? You're here, aren't you? The harbour's still here." He put his arm around her shoulders. "That suggests they chose carefully." Marin and Jules went down at the next low tide with a careful plan. They marked the Astrarium's location on a protected historical site map, documenting it as a significant nautical artefact. Then they positioned stones around it, not covering it completely but making it harder to access casually, harder for someone to stumble upon and turn without understanding what they were doing. The tide would still wash over it, the stars would still reflect in the puddles, but it would take deliberate effort, the kind of effort that meant whoever found it next would hopefully have the same respect for consequences that Marin had learned. Jules ran his final overlay, showing the harbour's shape evolution across their 2 weeks of trips and the final settled form. "It looks like a star," he said. From above, an irregular star pattern. Marin could see it. The jetties, the beach curves, the channel mouth. They formed a shape that echoed the brass disc's constellation rings, time and tide written into stone and sand. "We should go," Jules said. "Your dad wants help with Mrs. Chen's boat." They walked back along the jetty as the tide came in. Behind them, cold water covered the brass disc, and the meridian line disappeared under the surge. The harbour swayed gently, boats rocking at their moorings, waves lapping at stones that had, finally, agreed on where they wanted to be. Marin felt the weight lift from her chest, that constant background worry that something might shift when she wasn't looking. The harbour was done moving, at least done moving in ways that she had caused. The lighthouse beams swept across the water, and for just a moment Marin thought she saw it moving at that older, slower pace, golden instead of white. But then it was normal again, and she decided it was just her memory, just the echoes of all those nights in the past overlapping with the present. Which was fine. Some things should echo, some changes should leave traces. That's how you knew they mattered. She helped her father until dark, then walked home along the shore counting tide pools and checking star positions out of habit. Orion was rising right on schedule. The Pleiades hung where they belonged, and below them, the harbour held its shape, a compromise written in stone and star reflections, finally allowed to rest. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The workshop stood at the end of a gravel lane where the county road gave up on pavement and let the woods reclaim it. Jules had walked this path 100 times to visit Master Alder in summers past, carrying mason jars of wild blackberry and listening to the old man's stories about bees that knew the moon better than any almanac. Now the keys hung heavy in Jules's pocket, brass and iron, still warm from Aunt Mara's hand when she'd pressed them there that morning, with eyes too tired for grief. The door groaned open on leather hinges, and the smell hit first. Beeswax and honey, linseed oil, cedar shavings, and beneath it all something metallic and precise, the ghost of 1,000 wound springs. Dust moved in the slant light like pollen suspended in amber. Against the far wall stood the extractor, a radial drum of stained oak and tarnished brass, its treadle worn smooth by decades of feet. Pendulum clocks lined every surface, some stopped at different hours, others ticking in a rhythm that wasn't quite synchronized but close enough to sound like a single vast heartbeat with a limp. Jules set down the duffel bag, the one with drumsticks poking from the side pocket, and a bullet journal wrapped in a bandana to keep the pages from dog-earing. 16 years old and already cataloguing the world in columns and arrows, mapping cause to effect like a good scientist should, or at least like Tali always said a good scientist should. Tali from Physics Club, who could tap out 120 BPM on a table edge without counting, who built motion sensors from old phone parts and called it recycling. Tali would have questions about this place. Jules already had questions. The hive sat in the yard beyond the moon window, that odd circular pane Alder had cut into the south wall at exactly the angle to frame moonrise over the back field. 6 white boxes stacked in a configuration that didn't quite match the county extension pamphlets Jules had studied for 4-H. The frames inside, when Jules finally worked up the courage to crack the first hive, were wrong in a way that made the skin prickle. Not disease wrong, not pest wrong, pattern wrong. The comb cells formed rings instead of the standard hexagonal sheets. 29 cells in the first ring, 30 in another, embossed and perfect, each one catching light at a slightly different angle. Jules ran a gloved finger across them, and the hive hummed, a sound that wasn't quite angry, wasn't quite content, but felt like both at once, like a cord held too long, waiting for resolution. Inside the workshop, Alder's ledger lay open on the workbench, leather cracked at the spine, pages dense with cramped handwriting and musical notation. At the top of the first page, underlined 3 times, the old man had written, Synodic Rhythm 2953 Solar Days, the comb remembers. Below that, a table. BPM down the left margin, lunar day across the top, corrections in red ink for temperature and humidity. At 58.2 BPM, the notation read, D1, new, moon, cold wax, listen for the A-flat undertone. At 116.4 BPM, D29, waning crescent, warm, the hive will resist. Jules pulled the bullet journal from the bag and started copying, hand cramping around the pencil, drumsticks forgotten. The numbers formed their own rhythm. Every lunar day had its tempo. Every tempo had its corrections, and in the margins, Alder's spidery notes hinted at something else entirely. The extractor is not for honey. The honey is for moonrise. Do not confuse the two. 3 wax cylinders sat on a shelf above the workbench, labelled in Alder's hand. Comb Song D7, Comb Song D14, Comb Song D22. Jules had seen phonograph cylinders before, heard Edison recordings crackle through a horn at the county museum. These were different, handmade, the wax a deep amber that caught light like the honey itself, etched with grooves that seemed too fine, too regular. There was a mandrel attachment for the extractor's drive shaft, a playback head mounted on a gooseneck arm. It took 20 minutes to figure out the setup, another 10 to work up the nerve to spin the drum. The voice that emerged from the horn was Alder's, but younger, stronger, touched with an accent Jules couldn't place. Day 7, first quarter waxing. The comb sings in E major when the moon is ascendant. Spin at 87.6 to match the standing wave. Remember, boy, you're not making honey move. You're making time remember where it's been. The drum turned, the voice spoke through a haze of surface noise, and beneath it all the comb in the extractor, the lunar frame Jules had seated there without really thinking, began to hum. Not loud, not even quite audible unless you held your breath and leaned close. But it was there, a frequency that made the dust lift from the workbench and hang, suspended like the room itself was holding its breath. Jules looked down. The treadle was moving under one foot, pumping in a rhythm the body knew before the brain caught up. Drummer's instinct. 87.6 BPM. Close enough to the written tempo that the frame's hum shifted, deepened, locked into phase with the turning drum. The pendulum clocks all around stopped ticking. The dust hung. The workshop tilted, not like an earthquake, but like the world had suddenly remembered it was supposed to be somewhere else. And the somewhere else was here, 7 days ago, or 7 days forward, or 7 days sideways into a pocket the calendar had forgotten to mark. When the room settled, the light had changed. Still afternoon, but different. The dust on the windowsill formed the lines Jules hadn't made yet. Outside, the hives stood in the same configuration, but the landing boards were crowded with bees returning from forage, their hum pitched higher, more urgent. Jules stumbled to the door and looked out. The field beyond was full of goldenrod, the kind that bloomed in late September, except it was early October now, wasn't it? Had been before. The bullet journal's last entry was dated October 3rd. This was September 26th. The phone in Jules' pocket had no signal. Not no bars, but no concept of signal at all. The screen locked on a clock that read 4:47 p.m. and wouldn't update. 7 days back. Day 7 of the lunar cycle. First quarter waxing. The comb had sung and the room had listened. Alder's note said, "To return, feed the queen a teaspoon of fresh present-day honey at moonrise. Not past honey, not future honey. Today's jar, from the shelf, unopened until the moment. Warm it in your hands. Let her taste now." Jules ran back inside. The honey shelf held jars labelled by date, Alder's careful script noting moon phase and nectar source. October 3rd, 2024. Wildflower plus aster. The jar's wax seal was intact. Jules cracked it with shaking hands, dipped a silver teaspoon to the level mark engraved on the handle, and waited. The moon window showed only daylight. Hours yet before the moon would clear the tree line. Hours to stand in a workshop that was 7 days younger than it should be, watching dust settle and clocks refuse to tick. When moonrise came, it came as a sliver of white cresting the field's edge, cold and sharp. Jules opened the nearest hive, carefully the way Alder had taught, smoke first, gentle hands, and found the queen by the glow of a red-filtered headlamp. She was larger than the workers, more golden, moving with the slow confidence of something that knew its own importance. Jules held the teaspoon to her mandibles and she drank, delicate and sure, and the workshop shuddered and untilted, and the clocks all started again at once, a cacophony that resolved into their usual half-synchronized beat. October 3rd, 4:47 p.m. The phone signal bars flickered back. 17 missed texts from Aunt Mara, increasingly worried. But when Jules checked the message timestamps, they were wrong. Garbage day was supposed to be Thursday. Mara's shift at the clinic was Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday. Now the calendar on the phone showed garbage collection on Tuesday, and Mara's schedule had shifted to Monday, Thursday, Sunday, and the memories in Jules's head said both were true, or had been true, or would be true depending on which week you asked. Aunt Mara found Jules sitting on the workshop steps at dusk, bullet journal open, trying to map the paradox. "You missed dinner," she said, not unkindly, and then frowned. "Wait. No. That's tomorrow, isn't it?" She checked her own phone and the confusion in her face was sharp enough to ache. I could have sworn my shift was this morning. It was, Jules said. It will be. I think I broke the week. The explanation took until full dark, and Mara didn't believe it until Jules showed her the ledger, played the wax cylinder, spun the extractor without any frame seated, and demonstrated how the room stayed perfectly still, unimpressed. Alder was always strange, Mara said finally, but he wasn't a liar. If he wrote it, there's truth in it somewhere. She looked at the lunar comb frame, still damp with honey, humming its faint chord, in the cooling air. Can you fix it? I don't know, Jules said, but I think I need help. Tali arrived the next morning with a duffel bag of sensors, a contact microphone, a phone running an open-source tachometer app, and a vibrating metronome strapped to one wrist. Show me, Tali said, and Jules did. They spent 3 hours mapping the extractor's actual BPM against the dial settings, discovering that Alder's corrections were essential. Warm wax lowered the effective tempo by 1.2 to 1.8 BPM depending on ambient humidity. Cold wax raised it, and the bees themselves influenced the standing wave in ways that defied simple measurement. Tali stuck the contact mic to the drum's centre boss and fed the output through a spectrum analyzer on the phone. There, Tali said, pointing to a peak that wobbled between 426 and 429 Hz. That's your lock frequency. When the comb matches that, you're in phase. That's your door. They practiced with short jumps. Day 14, the full moon eve, spinning at 108.7 BPM with corrections for a warm afternoon and active foragers. The room tilted, and they arrived at the night of last year's harvest festival. The field beyond lit with bonfires and voices singing songs Jules half remembered from childhood. They stayed only minutes, long enough for Tali to record the ambient sound, and for Jules to retrieve a pendulum bob that had fallen behind the workbench in that timeline. At moonrise, Jules fed the Queen and they returned, and the week reshuffled again. Garbage day moved to Friday. The clinic schedule floated. Tali's physics club lab session, definitely scheduled for Wednesday morning, now showed on Monday afternoon, and Tali's memories insisted both were correct. This is getting worse, Tali said, staring at the phone's calendar, watching events drift like loose papers in a breeze. Every jump reorders the last 7 days. If we keep testing, we'll lose track entirely. Alder knew, Jules said, flipping through the ledger to a page near the back, the ink darker, more recent. He calls it the 7-frame stitch. 7 consecutive lunar days, visited in order within one present day, then one clean return at moonrise. It resequences everything, resets the week. 7 jumps in one day? Tali's voice went flat. That's 7 moonrises. Impossible. Not moonrises, jumps. We visit 7 dates, stay just long enough to mark them, and return here between each one. Then tonight, at actual moonrise now, one final return with fresh honey. The pattern stitches the week back into sequence. And if we miss the BPM? If the comb doesn't lock? Jules looked at the extractor, its drum scarred and patient. Then we're stuck, or the week stays broken, or both. Alder's notes say BPM tolerance is plus or minus 0.2. Tali, you can tap 120 BPM on a table for 10 minutes without drifting. We can do this. We'd better, Tali said, because that afternoon Ms. Braun arrived. She came in a white pickup with Braun Industrial Apiary stencilled on the door, pulling up the gravel lane with the confidence of someone who owned everything she looked at. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, boots polished despite the mud season. She introduced herself to Aunt Mara on the porch and didn't wait for an invitation before walking toward the hives. Jules intercepted her at the moon window. Private property, Jules said, keeping voice level, hands loose. Drummer's hands ready to catch a beat or throw it back. Master Alder kept exceptional stock, Ms. Braun said, not quite smiling. I've been trying to acquire his queens for years. Now that he's passed, my condolences, truly. I'd like to make an offer. Fair market value, plus a premium for the, unique genetics. They're not for sale. Ms. Brown's eyes flicked to the extractor visible through the workshop door to the lunar frame stacked beside it. I run a modern operation, dear. Temperature control, artificial comb, maximised yield. Alder's methods were quaint, but productivity demands efficiency. I can give these bees the resources they deserve. She pulled a folded paper from her jacket. I filed a courtesy inspection with the county. If your apiary doesn't meet current standards, they'll need to be relocated, for public health. When? Aunt Mara asked from the porch, voice tight. End of week. Friday, I believe. Or was it Monday? The county office has been disorganised lately. Ms. Brown smiled then, thin and knowing. I'm sure you'll pass. But if not, my facility is equipped for immediate rehoming. She left. Jules watched the truck disappear down the lane and felt the weight of 5 days, or 3, or 7, pressing down like a hand on the chest. Tali looked at the ledger, at the 7-frame stitch instructions, at the moon window where the afternoon light was already slanting toward evening. Tonight or never, Tali said. The lunar cycle is D10 right now. We need to jump through D10 to D16, 7 days in sequence. Before moonrise, Jules said. We have maybe 5 hours. They prepped the workshop like a surgical theatre. Wax thermometer on the workbench, humidity meter on the windowsill, Tali's vibrating metronome strapped to Jules's wrist set to pulse at the target BPM, a stethoscope borrowed from Aunt Mara's nurse kit to listen for the comb's lock frequency. The lunar frames came out of the hives one by one, still heavy with capped honey, each one humming its particular note when Jules held them to the light. The extractor's leather drive belt had cracked earlier that week, whichever week it had been, and they'd replaced it with a jury-rigged length of waxed canvas that slipped occasionally but held. Jules marked each frame with a dot of paint on the top bar, D10 blue, D11 red, D12 yellow, and so on through D16 violet. Corrections, Tali said, reading from the ledger. D10er, waxing gibbous, BPM 98.4, warm wax subtracts 1.6. Final tempo 96.8. Jules seated the blue frame, checked the wax thermometer, 68 degrees, warm enough, and started, pumping the treadle. The drum spun, picking up speed, the metronome on Jules's wrist vibrating in steady pulses. 96.8 BPM. The comb's hum started low, rose, wobbled, then locked. The workshop tilted and they were there, 5 days ago, late morning, the hives loud with October foragers. Jules tapped the nearest pendulum clock once with a drumstick, a marker, proof of visit, and pulled a single capped cell of honey with a clean knife, dropping it in a labelled vial for humidity calibration. 30 seconds. Back to the extractor. At moonrise in that frame of time, Jules fed the queen, and the room untilted. Back. October 3rd. The week still scrambled. Garbage day Tuesday, clinic Monday. Tali checked the spectrum analyzer. Lock frequency stable. Next. D11. BPM 100.2, minus 1.4 for warm wax. Frame seated, treadle pumping, the metronome pulsing against skin like a second heartbeat. Lock, tilt. This time, early evening, 6 days back, the field bronze with slant light. Clock tap, honey sample, queen feeding, return. The pendulum's tick sounded rougher now, syncopated, as though they were arguing over which beat to follow. D12, 102.0 BPM, warm wax minus 1.5. Jules's legs burned from pumping the treadle, but the rhythm was easy, natural, the tempo a friend. Lock, tilt. 4 days back, afternoon thunderstorm, rain hammering the roof, bees clustered inside the hive boxes. Tap, sample, feed, return. The workshop smelled like ozone and honey and brass polish. Aunt Mara brought water bottles and watched from the doorway, silent, her own phone's calendar flickering like a candle in wind. D13, 103.8 BPM. D14, full moon, 105.6 BPM. D15, 107.4 BPM. Each jump smoother than the last, Jules and Tali moving like a two-piece band locked into a groove, the extractor's drum singing, the comb's standing wave blooming into chords that made the dust rise and dance. The painted frames swapped in and out, each one heavier than it should be, resonant, alive in a way that had nothing to do with bees and everything to do with the moon's slow pull on tides and time and the architecture of attention. D16, waning gibbous, BPM 109.2, minus 1.3 for warm wax, final tempo 107.9, the last frame. Jules's hands shook as it seated in the drum, not from fear but from something else, a sense of standing on the edge of a rhythm too large to hear all at once but impossible to ignore. Tali's metronome pulsed. Jules pumped the treadle. The comb locked, and the room tilted, and they were tomorrow, or yesterday, or the day after the day before, standing in a workshop that was perfectly familiar and utterly strange because it hadn't happened yet. Outside, Ms. Braun's white truck sat in the gravel lane, empty, and through the moon window Jules could see her walking the hives with a man in a county jacket, clipboard in hand. "Tomorrow's inspection," Jules whispered. "We're seeing tomorrow." "Doesn't matter," Tali said. "Mark it and return. We're almost done." Clock tap, honey sample, and then, as Jules reached for the queen cage, a pounding on the workshop door, heavy and official. Ms. Braun's voice muffled. "County apiary inspection. Open up." The knocking came from outside the frame of the jump, from tomorrow's timeline, but it bled through somehow, vibration travelling across the locked frequencies. The queen stirred, agitated. Jules held the teaspoon steady, the present-day honey. October 3rd, wildflower and aster, the jar's seal broken this morning in the reel now, and let the queen drink as moonrise touched the window's edge. The room shuddered and untilted, and the pounding stopped. Not because it had ended, but because it hadn't started yet. Wouldn't start for hours. Back. October 3rd. The moon window showed late afternoon light, the real moon just beginning to climb above the tree line. The 7 frames sat in a row on the workbench, each one tapped and sampled and returned from. They're humming quieter now, harmonising in a chord that was almost but not quite resolved. One more step. Jules took the present-day jar, the October 3rd honey, and held it between both palms, warming it, feeling the wax seal soften under skin heat. Tali watched the moon window tracking the white curve as it cleared the field. 2 minutes, Tali said. BPM doesn't matter for this part, just the honey and the timing. And the queen, Jules said, already moving toward the hives, the jar cradled like something fragile and essential, which it was. The evening air smelled like cut grass and wood smoke. The bees were settling for night, their hum dropping to a low drone, and when Jules opened the hive and found the queen, she was waiting, still, as though she'd known this moment was coming all along. At moonrise, exactly as the first sliver of light touched the hive box, Jules fed her. 1 level teaspoon, the honey golden and thick, tasting of now, of this day, this hour, this breath. The queen drank. The workshop behind them shuddered, a sound like a sigh, and the world clicked into place. Inside, the pendulum clocks stopped arguing and found their rhythm. The dust settled in lines that made sense. Jules pulled out the bullet journal and checked the last week's entries, and they were there, solid, real, events landing on the days they belonged to. Garbage collection, Thursday. Aunt Mara's clinic shifts Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday. Tali's physics lab Wednesday morning. The phone's calendar stopped flickering and locked, the dates stable, the week no longer trying to be 7 different things at once. Aunt Mara stood in the workshop doorway, her own phone in hand, and the confusion in her face had smoothed into something like relief. "The medication delivery," she said slowly. "It's scheduled for today, not yesterday, not tomorrow. Today, I remember now, correctly." Ms. Braun's truck arrived the next morning for the county inspection. The man with the clipboard checking hive spacing and mite counts and disease signs, finding nothing amiss. The bees calm and productive and humming their ordinary hum. Ms. Braun watched from beside her truck, eyes narrow, and when the inspector signed off, she left without a word, the white pickup kicking up gravel dust that settled quickly in the still air. Jules labelled a fresh jar of honey, October 4th, wildflower and aster, and scratched into the wax seal, for moonrise only. It went on the shelf beside Alder's other dated jars, a marker for some future emergency, some future need. The extractor got a new belt, proper leather this time, and a tag wired to the drum's hub. BPM is a promise. The lunar frames went back into their hives, still humming, still holding their synodic calendar in cells of wax and time. Tali made copies of Alder's ledger, scanned every page, backed up the files, and sent one set to the County Historical Society with a note. Beekeeping archive, local interest, methods archaic but effective. The original stayed in the workshop, locked in a cedar drawer with the wax cylinders and the silver feeding spoon. On the wall calendar, Jules wrote across the last 7 days in red pen, kept in time. Not fixed, not corrected, kept like a promise, like a rhythm held steady against the world's inclination to drift. The bees outside worked their ordinary miracles, turning nectar into honey, building comb, feeding the queen, dying and being born in cycles that predated clocks and would outlast them. The moon rose every night at its appointed hour, pulling tides and time in equal measure, and the lunar comb sang softly in the hives, a chord that never quite resolved but never needed to. Jules sat on the workshop steps at dusk, drumsticks in hand, tapping out rhythms on the worn wood. 96.8 BPM, 107.9 BPM, 58.2 BPM for new moon someday when the need arose. Aunt Mara brought tea and sat beside them, not asking questions, just listening to the tap, tap, tap and the distant hum of bees settling for night. The week stretched ahead, ordinary and strange, each day landing where it belonged, and for now, for this moment between moonrise and dark, that was enough. The extractor stood silent in the workshop, its drum empty, patient, waiting. The pendulum clocks ticked in their imperfect unison. The moon window framed nothing but field and sky, and the slow arc of celestial mechanics grinding on, indifferent and precise. And in the hives, the queens laid their eggs in lunar rings, one cell for each day of the synodic month, building a calendar that didn't care what humans called Tuesday or October or now, only that the rhythm held and the comb remembered, and moonrise came when it was called. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. The storm came at dusk, slamming into the jetty with fists of green water and pulling the sky down low enough to taste salt. Nia had watched it build all afternoon from the harbour master's shed, where she'd been logging tide tables into her phone, tracing the moon's pull across a week's worth of numbers like they were some kind of scripture. She was 16 and had grown up with one foot on planks and the other in charts, reading navigation marks the way other kids read comics, seeing patterns in current and wind that most people mistook for chaos. The harbour was her text. The boats were her alphabet. When the wind finally broke, it left debris scattered along the waterline like offerings. Driftwood, a torn fender, half a lobster pot, and there, wedged against the north piling with its painter tangled in rockweed, a lifeboat. It was old. Paint peeling in long white scrolls, bronze fittings gone green with age, wooden thwarts worn smooth by hands long dead. But the thing that stopped Nia mid-step, phone forgotten in her pocket, was the lantern. Copper, tall as her forearm, mounted on a swivel bracket near the bow. Its glass was fogged but intact, and inside the housing she could see a coil of metal, intricate as jewellery, waiting. Gran Maris came down the path with her cane tapping stones, moving faster than Nia had seen her move in months. The old woman had kept the lighthouse before automation came, before the Coast Guard went digital and left keepers to retirement and memory. She stopped at the water's edge and stared at the boat with an expression Nia couldn't name. Not surprise. Something older. "We should tow it in," Nia said. Gran didn't answer right away. The wind pushed her white hair across her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of something rehearsed, something held too long in the throat. "Yes," she said, "we should." They hauled it to the town dock with Nia's dad's skiff, and Gran paid the harbour master to let them moor it overnight. Said it was salvage, said she'd file the paperwork, but when they were alone in the fading light, Gran reached into the lifeboat and touched the copper lantern with fingertips that remembered its shape. "It burns seawater," she said quietly. "There's a coil inside that cracks it into flame. Pale fire, cold as starlight. When you light it at night over deep water, the keel leaves a wake you can see from the sky." Nia waited. Gran never spoke like this, never gave away mysteries before they'd been earned. "I want you to have it," Gran continued, "and I want you to promise me you'll leave it dark. There are old nights out there, girl, nights that still exist if you know how to draw the path. But every door you open shifts the frame. Maps aren't fixed. They're agreements. Break enough of them and home stops being a place you recognise." She pulled a rolled chart from her bag, oilskin yellowed with age, and a bottle no bigger than a flask, dusty glass with a cork sealed in wax. The bottle's label, hand-lettered and faded, read Dawn. "This was my grandfather's," Gran said, unrolling the chart on the dock. "He was a navigator on the packet ships, drew these before he died." The chart showed open water, no coastline, just compass bearings and depth soundings. But scattered across its surface were spirals, dozens of them, each drawn in pencil with a date beside it in cramped script. Some spirals looped once, tight as a fist. Others unfurled in 2 or 3 slow turns, wide as cartwheel ruts. Margin notes tracked wind, current, star positions. A scale ring in the corner tied spiral radius to hours elapsed. "What are they?" Nia asked. "Patterns," Gran said. "If you steer the boat at night so your glowing wake matches one of these, direction, size, loops, and close it precisely, the sea goes dark and you slip through. You arrive at the same place, but on the night written on the chart, the date loops. You're there." Nia's pulse kicked. Time travel. Of a kind, not forward, only back, and only on water, only at night. Gran tapped the bottle. "This is how you come home. Fill it at dawn from your own shore. When you want to return, pour it over the lantern flame. It snuffs the pattern and brings you to the now. But if you use the wrong water, you'll land somewhere else, a few meters off. A block. It compounds. The map drifts." "Drifts?" "Home moves," Gran said simply. "Addresses shift. Parcel lines bend. Streets creep. Most people never notice. They think the old maps were wrong, that memory's faulty. But it's real. Every trip changes the territory. That's why the bottle must be filled at sunrise on the exact beach you mean to return to. Home water. Dawn water. It holds the coordinates." Nia looked at the spirals again, at the careful dates, at the handwriting of a man who'd died before she was born. Her hands itched to touch the chart, to trace the lines, to light the lantern and see what a glowing wake looked like from above. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked. Gran folded the chart and pressed it into Nia's hands along with the bottle. "Because you're the kind of fool who'll try it no matter what I say. Better you have the rules than learn them the hard way. And because I'm old, and when I'm gone, someone should know the cost." She left Nia on the dock as the last light bled from the sky. Nia didn't wait. She knew she should have. She knew Gran had given her the chart as a warning, not an invitation. But the pull was too strong, the mystery too bright. That night, after her parents were asleep, she walked back to the harbour with a flashlight, the chart and the bottle. The lifeboat rocked gently in its slip, patient as a horse. She climbed in. The copper lantern was cold under her palm. There was a valve at its base, a hose that trailed over the gunnel into the water. She opened it. Seawater hissed into the lantern's chamber, and the coil inside began to glow faint blue, then white, then a colour that had no name, something between lightning and frost. The flame rose without heat, humming like a struck bell. The wake appeared immediately, bioluminescent, milky, trailing behind the keel in a ribbon that didn't fade. It hung in the water like ink suspended in oil, glowing softly, visible even in the dark. Nia cast off. She'd rowed enough boats to know how they moved, how to pull on one oar and push the other to spin in place. She unrolled the chart and chose the smallest spiral, dated last August, just a few months back. One loop, tight, counterclockwise, simple. She began to row. The wake responded instantly, bending as she turned, holding its shape behind her. She adjusted, corrected, watched the glowing line curve in the black water. A quarter turn, half, 3/4. The air grew heavier, the stars brighter. Her breath fogged. She closed the loop, bringing the bow around to meet the starting point, and the wake touched itself, a perfect circle, and the world snapped. Silence. Then sound rushed back, but wrong, different. Fireworks bloomed over the bay, red and gold, and music drifted from the pier where a crowd had gathered. August, the summer festival. Nia saw her mother, alive and laughing, standing near the bandstand with her dad's arm around her shoulders. Her mother had been dead 2 years. Nia's throat closed. She wanted to call out, to row closer, to touch her mother's hand, but she knew better. Gran's warning echoed. She reached for the bottle, uncorked it, and poured the dawn water over the lantern flame. The light died. The sound cut. The sky blinked, and she was back in the present, floating in the dark harbour under familiar stars. Her hands shook. Her face was wet. She rowed to the dock and tied off, then sat in the boat for a long time, breathing, remembering her mother's laugh, the shape of her smile. It wasn't until morning that she noticed the mailbox. Their house was a 10-minute walk from the harbour, a blue cape with a flagstone path and a cedar mailbox at the street. Nia had walked that path 1,000 times. But when she came home and glanced at the mailbox, something was wrong. It was offset. Not by much, maybe a foot, but it was no longer aligned with the driveway. The stones beneath it had shifted, grass growing in new seams. She pulled out her phone and checked the GPS pin for her address. It was wrong, a metre east of where it should be. She called Ezra. Ezra was a year older, technically 17, but functionally 30 when it came to maps and overlays and drone footage. They'd met in the high school GIS club, which was really just the two of them, and a teacher who let them use the computer lab after hours. Ezra tracked everything, logged coordinates, built change detection models for coastal erosion. If anyone could tell her whether she was losing her mind, it was Ezra. He came over that afternoon with his laptop and a drone in a hard case. They stood in Nia's driveway while Ezra pulled up satellite images, tax parcel, overlays, old property surveys. "Look," he said, pointing at the screen. "This is last month. Your mailbox is here, aligned with the driveway centre line. This is today." He toggled layers. It's moved, and not just the box, the whole parcel boundary. It's bent, like someone pulled it east and it dragged everything with it. "How is that possible?" Nia asked. "It's not," Ezra said, "unless someone resurveyed and didn't tell anyone. But that doesn't explain the Google pin. Pins are crowdsourced, auto-corrected by user data. For it to shift, reality has to shift." Nia told him everything. The lifeboat, the lantern, the chart, the spiral, her mother, the dawn bottle. Ezra listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he believed her. "Okay," he said finally. "We need to test this. Controlled conditions. I'll fly the drone, record the wake from above. You do another spiral, something small, and we'll measure the delta when you get back." They became methodical. Nia would take the boat out at night, light the lantern, steer a spiral from the chart while Ezra filmed from shore with his drone. Each time she closed a loop and slipped through, she'd spend a few minutes in the past, seeing things that were gone, then snuff the flame with the dawn water and return. Each time something moved, a fence angled differently, a street sign rotated 10 degrees, a neighbour's address geocoded to the wrong side of the block. Ezra built a drift model, plotting the deltas, calculating vectors. The pattern was clear. The farther back the date, the larger the spiral, the bigger the shift on return. Small trips moved things centimetres, larger jumps moved them metres. "It's like the map is made of fabric," Ezra explained one night in his basement, showing Nia a simulation he'd built. "Every time you complete a spiral, you pull a thread. The weave tightens in one place, loosens in another. Do it enough, and the whole thing warps." "Can we fix it?" Nia asked. "Theoretically. If you could run a counter pattern, a spiral that mirrors the original but in reverse, it might stitch things back. But you'd need precision, perfect closure, and you'd have to snuff it with water from the exact shore you want to lock home to." Nia thought of the dawn bottle, now half empty. Gran had been clear. It had to be refilled at sunrise on their beach. Home water. But she couldn't stop. The past was too close, too vivid. She started taking longer trips, chasing dates on the chart that promised meaning. A night in the 1930s when pilot whales had beached and the whole town had come to push them back to sea. A rescue in 1895 where a lightship had saved a foundering schooner. Each return brought more drift. The school's address updated wrong in the county database. A paramedic truck took the long route because its GPS believed the road curved differently than it did. People noticed, but they explained it away. Old maps were inaccurate. Surveying equipment had improved. Memory played tricks. Only Nia and Ezra knew the truth. Then Captain Rowe arrived. He showed up at the harbour one morning in a fast rib with twin outboards and a smile that was all teeth. Rowe was maybe 40, tanned and handsome in the way that made people trust him too quickly. He wore expensive foul-weather gear and moved like someone who'd spent his life taking things that weren't his. "Heard you've got a lifeboat," he said to Nia, leaning against the dock piling like they were old friends. "Unusual rig, copper lantern, glows at night." "So?" Nia said. "So I'm a salver," Rowe said. "Wrecks, artifacts, lost cargo. I specialise in finding things that shouldn't be found. And that lantern, that's a tool I could use. It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale," Rowe said. "But I'm not talking about buying. I'm talking about partnership. You've been running patterns, haven't you? Slipping back. I can see the shimmer on the water at night. I know what it means." Nia's stomach dropped. "How?" "I've been looking for a boat like yours for 20 years, Rowe said. "There used to be a dozen. Now there's one. And you have it." He pulled a photo from his pocket, a creased image of a spiral chart. Not Gran's, but similar. "I had a copy made from an old logbook. I've been trying to make it work with modern lights, LEDs, battery arrays, but it never holds. The wake doesn't glow right. You've got the real thing. The copper coil, the seawater burn. Let me use it. I'll pay you. Cash, internship, references, whatever you need. To do what? Nia asked. Salvage, Rose said. But salvage that isn't lost yet. Cargo before it sinks. Gold before it scatters. We go back, we mark it, we file claims. Legal, clean, just time assisted. That's theft, Ezra said from behind Nia. He'd been listening from the dock shed. Rose shrugged. Maps are suggestions. So's time. If I can get there first, I earned it. Get out, Nia said. Rose's smile didn't waver. You'll change your mind, he said, especially when the drift gets worse. He left, but the threat lingered like smoke. Nia tried to stop. She really did. But one night she found a spiral dated 1895, a big one, 3 loops, and she thought of the wreck Gran's grandfather had written about in the margin, a packet ship driven onto shoals in a nor'easter. Survivors none. If she could go back, if she could warn them, steer them clear. She lit the lantern and ran the spiral. It took an hour to complete, fighting current and wind, trimming the wake to match the pattern. When the loop closed, the sea went black as ink, and she was there, storm-tossed, the packet ship a ghost in the fog. She rowed toward it, screaming warnings, waving her lantern. The ship turned. It missed the shoals. It lived. She snuffed the flame and returned to the present. The harbour was wrong. The channel had moved. The main shipping lane, marked on every chart, every GPS, had relocated 100 metres south. Her father's tug contract specified the old channel. It was void. The pier sat over mudflats at low tide. Businesses lost mooring access. The harbour master's office sent emergency updates, but no one understood how it had happened. Nia understood. She had done this. She had pulled the thread too hard. Roe came back that night. I can fix it, he said. Let me have the lantern. I'll run a brute force correction, spiral after spiral until the channel snaps back. That'll make it worse, Ezra said, showing him the drift model. You'll knot the whole region. It's not about force. It's about precision. Then teach me precision, Roe said. Nia refused, but Roe didn't need permission. He'd taken a photo of Gran's chart on his phone the day he'd visited. 2 nights later, she saw his Arab out past the breakwater, a crude lantern rigged to his bow, glowing sickly yellow. He was trying to run a spiral. He failed. The wake didn't hold. It frayed, twisted, and when he tried to close the loop, he crossed his own path too early. The wake knotted, a cold whirl forming in the water, a vortex where compasses spun and GPS glitched, and the air tasted like ozone and old salt. The drift spiked, roads bent, buildings geocoded to wrong parcels, an ambulance missed an address and arrived 15 minutes late. A man died waiting. Nia sat on the dock that night, head in her hands, and cried. Gran came down in the dark, slower now, leaning heavy on her cane. She sat beside Nia and didn't speak for a long time. Finally she said, There's a way to fix it, but you'll have to give up the lantern. How? Nia asked. A counter pattern, Gran said. The spirals that moved the map can stitch it back. You draw a mirror spiral centred on home and snuff it with dawn water from the exact beach you want to lock. It stitches the fabric tight, pulls the threads back into place. But it has to be perfect. One mistake and you'll make it worse. And after, you can never use the lantern again. The pattern will hold, but only if you leave it alone. Nia looked at the dawn bottle. It was nearly empty. I need to refill it. At sunrise, Gran said. On our beach. Home water. They waited for clear weather. A week of storms rolled through. Heavy skies and slant rain that turned the sea grey and opaque. No sunrise, no refill. The drift continued to compound. Roe's knot pulling at the edges of reality like a wound that wouldn't close. Then, finally, a morning broke clear. Green flash at sunset the night before, a promise of fair skies. Nia and Ezra met at the beach before dawn, the horizon still dark, the stars fading. Nia uncorked the bottle and held it in the surf, letting the cold Atlantic fill it as the first thread of light touched the water. Home, she whispered. They sailed before full light, the lantern dark, the charts spread on the thwart between them. Ezra had overlaid the drift model onto a transparency, marked the centre point of the counter-spiral using triangulation. The lighthouse, the bellbuoy, the church steeple. 3 points. A lock. Radius matches the biggest spiral you ran, Ezra said. 3 loops, counterclockwise. You'll need to compensate for wind and current. If the wake drifts even a metre off the pattern, it won't close. I know, Nia said. She lit the lantern. The pale flame rose, cold and bright, and the wake began to glow. Ezra launched his drone, the camera tracking from above, feeding the image to a tablet bungeed to the gunnel. Nia could see her own wake from the sky, a luminous thread drawing across black water. She began to row. The first loop was wide, each stroke measured, each adjustment precise. Ezra called headings, keeping her on track, his voice steady. The wind pushed from the west, trying to yaw the boat, but Nia leaned into it, pulling harder on the right oar, letting the current help her curve. 1 loop closed. The wake kissed its starting point and continued spiralling inward. That's when Ro's rib appeared, roaring out from behind the breakwater, spotlight cutting the dark. He's trying to intercept, Ezra said. Let him, Nia said, not breaking rhythm. He doesn't have home water. He can't land where we're going. Ro closed fast, his rib throwing spray, but Nia was already into the second loop, tighter now, harder to steer. The wake glowed brighter as the pattern converged, the spiral pulling inward like a nautilus shell. Hold your line, Ezra said, voice tight. A gust hit from the north, unexpected, yawning the arc wide. The wake drifted off the overlay by 1/2 metre. Nia swore, shipped the oars, and grabbed the tiller instead, using a back eddy she'd noticed earlier, a pocket of stillness near the bellbuoy. She slipped into it, let the current swing her bow and threaded the gap, bringing the wake back onto the pattern. 3rd loop, final turn. Ro's Arib came alongside and he leaned over the rail, shouting, "You're going to waste it. Let me through." Nia ignored him. The wake was closing, the glowing line spiralling inward to meet its heart. 10 metres. 5. 2. She held her breath, pulled one last stroke, and the wake touched itself at the centre. The sea went black, mirror black. The stars vanished. Nia grabbed the dawn bottle, uncorked it with shaking hands, and poured it over the lantern flame. The water hissed. The flame died. Silence pressed down like a weight, and then the stars blinked back, and the world snapped into place with a sound like fabric tearing and then stitching itself whole. The wake faded. The sea was just sea again. Ezra checked his tablet, overlaying GPS pins, parcel boundaries, street grids. It worked, he said, voice hushed. Look, the lines are relaxing, the drift's reversing. Nia watched on the screen as addresses slid back into alignment, as the harbour channel remet its marked coordinates, as fences straightened and roads unbent. Not perfectly. There was a faint warp still visible in the shoreline, a compass rose bend that would remain forever, a signature only they would know. But home was home again. Ro's Orib sat dead in the water, engine sputtering. He'd tried to follow them through, but without home dawn he'd landed somewhere else, some other when. His radio crackled nonsense, his GPS showing coordinates that didn't exist. Nia and Ezra rowed back to the dock as the real dawn broke, spilling gold across the water. Gran was waiting. She took the chart, the lantern, the empty bottle, and nodded once. "You did well," she said. They sealed the lantern in a glass case at the Maritime Museum, labelled it a salvaged artefact, said nothing about what it could do. Once a year, on the morning of the summer solstice, Nia and Ezra walked to the beach at sunrise and filled the bottle with home water. They never lit the lantern. They never drew another spiral. They chose to leave the map where it lay, to let home be home, to keep the pattern without pulling the thread. But sometimes, on very clear nights, Nia would walk down to the harbour and look out at the black water, and she would remember the glow, the way the wake had hung in the dark like a promise, the way the past had opened under her hands like a door. She would remember her mother's laugh, the weight of the oars, the hum of the copper flame. Maps she had learned were not fixed. They were agreements, fragile and true, and home was not a place but a pattern you chose to maintain, a spiral you kept closing, a dawn you chose to hold. The sea rolled under the moon, the lantern stayed dark, and the mailbox, for what it was worth, stood exactly where it should, aligned with the driveway, rooted in stone and memory and the kind of truth that only comes from knowing what it cost to bring something back. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The sinkhole opened 3 days after the last snow melted, swallowing a corner of the old chapel yard like a hungry mouth. Arya found it on her way home from school, drawn by the yellow caution tape and the cluster of neighbours peering into the dark. The ground had fallen away in a neat circle, exposing not dirt but something pale and facetted, something that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in fragments. She returned at dawn with her geology pouch and Theo, who brought a cardboard sun model he'd stayed up half the night building. The groundskeeper, Dom, hadn't arrived yet. They ducked under the tape. "Halit," Arya said, touching the exposed edge. "Salt. Not loose crystals, but solid rock, carved smooth." Steps descended into shadow. Theo aimed his flashlight down. "That's not natural." "No, it's not." They went slowly, counting steps. 23 down, then the passage opened into a chamber so vast the flashlight beam couldn't find the far wall. The air tasted mineral and old. Arya's breath came out in a cloud despite the calendar saying spring. The walls glittered, not with ice, but with salt formations that caught and multiplied their light until the chamber seemed to breathe with pale fire. Columns rose from the floor like frozen waterfalls. Someone, long ago, had carved them into something deliberate, something cathedral-like. Ribs vaulted overhead. Alcoves held nothing but shadow. "Look up," Theo whispered. High above, a shaft pierced the ceiling, perfectly round, perfectly vertical. Morning light slanted through it at an angle, painting a bright oval on the western wall. As Arya watched, the oval crept downward, degree by degree. "A sun tube," she said, "like at Newgrange. Except that's for solstice dawn." Theo unfolded his cardboard model, adjusting the brass bolt that served as earth. I think this hits the floor at local noon." They waited. The morning stretched. Dom's voice echoed from above. He was checking the perimeter, talking to someone about permits and liability. Arya and Theo kept still, backs pressed to a salt column. At 12:47 by Theo's watch, the light shifted. The oval narrowed, concentrated, became a shaft so solid it seemed you could lean against it. It struck the centre of the chamber, illuminating a floor slab of dark halite smooth as glass. And on that slab, faintly visible now that light touched it, were marks, deliberate scratches, a pattern. Arya crouched beside it. The marks formed a figure 8 lying on its side, stretched between 2 points. Ticks divided it like a ruler. Dates, she realised. Old-style dates, chiselled shallow. The upper loop was labelled in Latin she half remembered from her mum's old books. Estus, summer. The lower loop, Hemes, winter. An analemma, Theo breathed. The path of the sun at noon across the year. The beam held for 3 minutes, then began to slide east. The figure 8 faded back into shadow. Arya already had her chalk out. She didn't trace the whole thing, not that first time. Just a small arc in the upper loop, bright white against dark salt. Theo calculated backward from his watch, and the equation of time, April 14th should sit right. There. She placed a clear quartz crystal from her pouch on the tick mark. Nothing happened. They sat in the dark for 20 minutes. Dom's footsteps crossed overhead. A raven called. Arya was about to pack up when Theo checked his watch and swore softly. "We used clock noon. It's 13 minutes off true solar noon here. The beam's already." The sun tube flared. Not the slow creep of morning, but a sudden column of light, thick and unwavering. It struck the crystal. The quartz blazed, and where the chalk lines glowed against the salt, the brine seams in the floor, hairline cracks Arya hadn't noticed, began to shine with a liquid blue-white light, as if something beneath the stone was waking up. The air bent. The chamber wall rippled like water, and through it Arya saw not stone but sunlight, wooden scaffolding, voices speaking a language that wasn't quite English, wasn't quite anything she knew. Theo grabbed her wrist. "Don't." But she'd already stepped through. The chamber was the same but different, younger. The salt columns less weathered, the alcoves still bearing carved symbols that would erode away before her time. The sun tube admitted a shaft of light slightly thicker than she remembered. No debris yet, no centuries of accumulation. And on the floor the analemma was freshly cut, the ticks crisp as yesterday. Theo stumbled through behind her, eyes wide. The doorway hung in the air behind them, a shimmer of refracted light humming softly. April 14th, Arya said. But when? A man in wool breeches and a linen shirt appeared from one of the alcoves carrying a bucket. He stopped, stared at them, crossed himself, and ran. They left quickly. Arya scrawled a note on the back of a receipt. We were here, April 15th, 2024, A&T, and weighted it with a pebble in a corner alcove. Then she knelt by the brine fountain she'd noticed earlier, a carved lion's head that trickled a constant stream of saturated salt water into a shallow basin. The water felt warm and slippery. She dipped her chalk-stained fingers in it, then splashed the floor, washing over the bright lines. The chalk dissolved fast, milky clouds spreading through the brine. When the last trace lifted from the stone, the doorway flared again. They stepped back through into their own April afternoon, hearts hammering, and climbed the stairs into ordinary daylight. Dom was locking the chapel door. He didn't see them slip away. That evening, Arya opened her dresser drawer to find her house key lying where she always kept it. Except it wasn't metal anymore. It was salt. Perfect. Crystalline. Detailed down to the grooves and the small heart-shaped bow. She picked it up and it crumbled slightly in her hand, leaving a grit of sodium chloride on her palm. The real key was gone. She called Theo. He came over with his notebook and a ruler, and they sat on her bedroom floor while rain tapped against the window. A cost, he said quietly. You didn't mention a cost. I didn't know. One trip, one object. Maybe. Arya placed the salt key on her desk, brushed the powder from her hands. It looked ghostly under her lamp. Or maybe it's scales. Time spent, size of item. We were only there 15 minutes. Or maybe, Theo said, we shouldn't go back. But Arya was already sketching the analemma in her notebook, labelling the ticks, calculating. Her mother had died 2 years ago that October. If the dial could open any day, precisely placed. She didn't say it aloud. Theo watched her draw and said nothing. They went back 3 days later with better calculations and a plan. Arya chalked a date in 1918, November 11th, the miners' strike Dom had mentioned once. They stepped through into a chamber loud with men's voices, saw figures in caps and coveralls arguing by lantern light, and retreated after 60 seconds. Back home, Arya found her compass needle crystallised on her desk, the brass case still intact but the magnetised steel gone to salt. The next jump, 1793, the consecration ceremony. Robed figures, Latin hymns, the smell of incense and tallow. They stayed 4 minutes. Her phone case turned to salt that night, delicate and hollow, and when she tried to charge her phone the next morning, the metal charging port had transformed into a fragile lattice of halite crystals. Theo built a better gnomon from a dowel and a protractor, plotted the equation of time for every date on the analemma. Arya practised with different chalks, thick, thin, pressed hard or soft. She learned that sloppy lines left residue the brine couldn't quite reach, and twice she saw what she came to call ghost doors, faint, overlapping doorways where footsteps preceded bodies by seconds, where voices echoed out of sync, fractures in the neat flow of time. With each trip her collection grew, a photo of her mother, crystallised in its frame, the E-string peg from her violin, a tube of lip balm, a ballpoint pen, Theo's metronome Wait, which she'd borrowed and forgotten to return. He found it on his piano the morning after their 6th jump, a small salt cylinder that chimed softly when he touched it. This has to stop, he said, after one more. Arya was measuring the analemma with string and a protractor. If I complete both loops, summer and winter, the full figure 8, and erase them in one continuous session, I think it settles the debt, closes the circle, there's an old surveying principle, closing the traverse. This isn't surveying. It's geometry, and if there's a pattern, there's a rule. She tapped her notebook. The equinox is a nodal point, spring or autumn where the loops cross. If I do it then, under a clean beam with no interruptions, you'll what? Get your phone back. Your mum's photo. Arya's hands stilled. Maybe. Theo didn't argue. Further. But he started calculating the autumn equinox date, double-checking against 3 different sources, compensating for the cathedral's latitude and the slight drift of true north over centuries. The jumps grew longer. Arya went to 1640 when the chamber was new and stayed 20 minutes exploring the alcoves. She found fresh chisel marks, initials carved in Latin, and a woman in a grey habit sketching the analemma with charcoal. The woman looked up and smiled. You've come far to see this. Yes. Arya's Spanish was poor, but the woman seemed to understand. I am Magdalena. I tend the dial. She gestured at the floor, the sun tube, the careful measurements. It preserves what must not be lost. A day, perfectly kept. Do you understand? I think so. Good. Magdalena's eyes were kind and sharp at once. Then you know the price, but also the gift. Everything precious, saved in salt. Never rot, never fade. She reached out and gently took the crystal from Arya's hand, turning it over. Flawed, she murmured. The cleavage is imperfect. Let me fetch you a better one. She disappeared into an alcove. Arya waited, aware of the noon beam creeping across the floor, aware that she'd stayed too long. When Magdalena returned, she handed Arya a crystal that looked identical but felt different, heavier, or perhaps cooler. Arya thanked her and ran for the doorway, splashing brine over the chalk with shaking hands. Back home, she found her mother's locket on her dresser. The chain was still gold, but the hinged case had transformed into salt, and inside the tiny photograph was now a translucent mineral wafer. When Arya tried to open it, the whole thing crumbled. She sat on her bed and wept for the first time since the funeral. Theo found her there an hour later. He sat beside her in silence, then picked up one of the salt fragments. You have to stop. I know. Do you? The equinox. Arya wiped her eyes. One more time. I finish the pattern. And if it doesn't work, she didn't answer. The next 2 weeks were preparation and paranoia. A spring storm rolled through, and Arya watched the sun tube daily, terrified the beam wouldn't break through on the critical day. Dom announced the chamber would be sealed after the insurance inspection, structural concerns, liability, the usual bureaucratic litany. He'd already started moving equipment into the chapel basement. Arya's jumps became erratic. She tried to visit 1634, the year the dial was first carved, but the flawed crystal Magdalena had given her drifted the target by a day. She arrived in an empty chamber and heard voices one wall over, impossible to reach. When she returned, Theo's spare metronome weight and 2 of her own pencils had crystallized. The crystal's wrong, she told him, and Magdalena switched it. Why? Because she wants me to keep going. She said the dial preserves things, turns them into salt, into relics that never change. Arya paced her room, stepping over salt replicas, scattered like a strange museum. She wants everything I love salted and safe. That's not preservation, that's... I know. They made a plan. It required clearing the sun tube, recovering Arya's original crystal from Magdalena in 1634, and completing the full analemma in a single session on the autumn equinox, September 22nd by the old calendar, adjusted for drift, erasing it continuously at perfect local solar noon to settle the debt once and for all. The morning of the equinox came clear and cold. Arya and Theo met at the chapel before dawn, carrying rope, a pulley Theo had borrowed from his uncle, and Arya's entire geology kit. The sun tube had accumulated debris over the winter, a bird's nest, blown leaves, a century of dust. They rigged a pulley at the rim of the sinkhole and took turns lowering a bucket on a rope, clearing the shaft inch by inch while Dom's truck sat idle in the distant parking lot. By 10 a.m. the tube was clear. Theo set up his gnomon, a precisely levelled dowel on a marked board, and began tracking the shadow. Local solar noon would arrive at 12:03 p.m. They had one chance. At 11:45, Arya chalked the first loop of the analemma. Her hands were steady now, each line smooth and deliberate. The summer loop, Estus, curving through May and June and July. She placed Magdalena's flawed crystal aside and chalked onward, connecting to the winter loop, Hiems, descending through November and December and January. The figure 8 gleamed against the dark salt. 10 minutes, Theo said. Arya put down the chalk and picked up her last unsalted keepsake, a small magnifying lens her mother had used for field work, its brass rim worn smooth by years of handling. She held it for a moment, then set it in her pouch. I'm going back for the crystal. Arya, 5 minutes, I'll be fast. She placed the flawed crystal on the 1634 mark. The brine seams began to glow. The doorway shivered open, and Arya stepped through into a chamber lit by candles, and the noon beam slanting through a pristine sun tube. Magdalena was waiting, hands folded, smiling. "You've returned. I wondered if you would. You took my crystal. I gave you a better one. You gave me one that drifts. It doesn't land true." Arya kept her voice level. "I need mine back." "Why? This dial is a treasure, a way to preserve everything precious. Your mother's face saved forever in salt. Your friend's music crystallized into relics. You should be grateful." "I didn't want relics. I wanted to remember." Magdalena's smile thinned. "Memory fades, salt endures." "Memory lives." Arya stepped forward. "Give me the crystal." "I think not." The nun moved to block the alcove where she'd retrieved the false crystal weeks ago. Arya didn't hesitate. She darted left, ducked under Magdalena's reaching hand, and grabbed the small wooden box on the alcove shelf. Inside, nested in wool, was her crystal, the original, with its slight inclusion shaped like a leaf. Magdalena lunged. Arya threw the magnifying lens at her feet and ran for the doorway. Behind her, the nun's voice rose sharp and cold. "You'll lose everything. Better to save it, to keep it safe in salt." Arya splashed through the doorway and rolled onto the chamber floor in her own time. Theo was kneeling by the gnomon, eyes locked on the shrinking shadow. 3 minutes, he said. Arya placed her true crystal on the equinox node, the exact centre where the analemma's 2 loops crossed. The brine seams ignited, brighter than before, a lattice of light spreading through the floor. "Now," Theo said. She grabbed the bucket of brine they'd drawn from the fountain and began to pour. The water spread in a thin sheet across the analemma, dissolving the chalk from both loops at once. Arya worked in a spiral, inward and outward, keeping the wash continuous, no breaks, no missed lines. The figure 8 began to blur, summer and winter melting together. Behind her, the doorway flared. Magdalena's face appeared in it, furious, reaching through with one hand to smear the wet chalk, trying to force a permanent mark, a ghost door that would never close. Theo swept his arm through the pooling brine, pushing it toward the nun's hand. The salt water splashed across her fingers and she recoiled with a hiss, pulling back into 1634. The doorway wavered. "Faster," Theo said. Arya dumped the last of the bucket. The chalk lines ran together, dissolving into milky spirals. She dropped to her knees and scrubbed with her bare hands, feeling the salt abrade her skin, the brine stinging in a dozen small cuts. The last trace of chalk lifted from the stone like mist. The gnomon's shadow touched its equinox mark. Perfect solar noon. The chamber filled with light. Not white, but prismatic. Every colour the sun contained refracted through the crystal and thrown across the salt walls. The ghost doors Arya had left from sloppy erasures snapped shut with soft pops. The brine fountain surged, its trickle becoming a gout of water that flooded across the floor, drawing the last microscopic particles of chalk into solution. The crystal on the equinox node pulsed once, twice. The light peaked, painful and beautiful, and then the doorway, the real one, the complete one, the loop properly closed, flashed open and collapsed inward, sealing itself with a sound like a bell struck underwater. Silence. The noon beam faded to its ordinary slant. The chamber was just a chamber again, salt and shadow and the smell of brine. Arya and Theo lay on the floor gasping. Above them the sun tube admitted a soft column of afternoon light that meant nothing at all. That night, Arya returned to her room to find her salt collection unchanged. The key, the compass needle, the phone port, the locket, all still salt. But on her dresser, next to the crystallized remains, her actual house key lay shining and metal. Her compass sat in its case, needle trembling toward north. Her phone, when she picked it up, showed a crack in the screen but charged without trouble. Not everything returned. The locket stayed salt. So did the photo in its frame. Her mother's face now a permanent mineral ghost. The E-string peg from her violin. 2 pencils. A lip balm. The price of meddling, Arya thought. A reminder. She kept the salt key on her shelf next to the locket fragments. They caught the morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. Dom agreed, after some persuasion and a promise from Theo's uncle, who taught geology at the university, to keep the chamber accessible for research. They installed a gate at the sinkhole's rim, locked but not sealed. Theo posted their solar noon calculations and historical notes to the local archive. A graduate student wrote a paper on medieval timekeeping and sun tubes. Nobody mentioned doorways. Arya returned once, a week after the equinox, to check the analemma. The floor was clean, the chisel marks still visible but faint. She brought her chalk but didn't draw. Instead, she sat in the chamber at noon and watched the beam strike the empty stone, the pattern waiting, patient and silent. In her notebook that evening, she sketched a tiny analemma on the inside cover. She drew the summer loop, labelled the ticks, then stopped halfway through the winter curve. Unfinished. A promise or a warning, she wasn't sure which. She could return. The dial would still work. The dates were all there, chiselled and patient. But now she knew what it cost to travel, what it meant to salt the past into relics that could never change. Her mother's locket sat on the shelf, a fragile white ghost. Arya picked it up carefully and held it to the window. The afternoon light passed through it like glass, and for a moment she could almost see the photograph inside, preserved not in metal but in memory, in the ache of knowing it had been real. She set it down, closed her notebook, capped the chalk. The analemma could wait, the circle could stay open. Some things, she thought, were meant to be finished, and some things were meant to remain just out of reach, a door drawn but not opened, a pattern traced but not travelled, the last line left unwritten so the story could continue. Outside, the sun dropped toward the hills. In the cathedral beneath the chapel, the brine fountain trickled in steady time, dissolving nothing, preserving nothing, simply marking the hours as they passed. One noon, then another, each one arriving exactly when it was meant to, each one gone before you could trap it in salt or hold it in your hands. The analemma could wait, the circle could stay open. Some things, she thought, were meant to be finished, and some things were meant to remain just out of reach. A door drawn but not opened, a pattern traced but not travelled, the last line left unwritten so the story could continue. Outside, the sun dropped toward the hills. In the cathedral beneath the chapel, the brine fountain trickled in steady time, dissolving nothing, preserving nothing, simply marking the hours as they passed. One noon, then another, each one arriving exactly when it was meant to, each one gone before you could trap it in salt or hold it in your hands. Yet Arya found herself returning, not to travel, but to watch. She came on Tuesdays after school, when Dom was checking the northern fence line and the chapel stood empty. She would descend the 23 steps and sit in the dark, waiting for the beam. Theo joined her sometimes, bringing his gnomon updates and orbital calculations, but mostly he let her sit alone. The chamber had become a different place now that she knew its cost. The salt columns no longer seemed merely beautiful, but weighted, each facet a moment caught and held, each crystal a choice made and unmade. She wondered how many others had found the dial, how many had chalked the analemma and paid the price. The ghost doors she'd sealed, had they been hers alone, or remnants of travellers from centuries past, their imperfect erasures leaving fractures she'd finally closed? One Tuesday in October she found something new. A piece of paper, old and brittle, tucked into the alcove where she'd left that first note. She lifted it carefully. The handwriting was cramped. The ink faded to brown, but legible. To the girl who travels, beware preservation. What is saved in salt cannot grow. What is kept cannot become. St. Jerome has forgotten this. The dial was meant to teach us time, not trap it. When you finish the pattern, leave one tick unmarked. This is the keeper's final wisdom. Brother Andres, 1702. Arya read it 3 times, then folded it and placed it in her notebook. One tick unmarked. She thought of her half-drawn analemma, the winter loop left incomplete. Perhaps Brother Andres had understood something Magdalena never could, that completion meant ending, and some doors were healthier left ajar. At home that evening she found her father in the kitchen, cooking the pasta dish her mother used to make. He'd gotten the spices wrong, too much oregano, not enough basil, but he was trying. Arya watched him stir the pot, his shoulders slightly hunched, and thought about the salt locket on her shelf. She could go back to the day her mother died. October 17th, 2 years passed. She could chalk that date precisely, place the crystal, step through and see her one more time. But she would return to find what? Another object salted. Her father's watch, maybe. His wedding ring. The last photograph of them together. And her mother would still die, still be gone, still be nothing but a memory Arya carried forward alone. She set the table instead. They ate in quiet, and the pasta tasted wrong but warm, and that was enough. The graduate student, a woman named Clara who wore her hair in 2 long braids and smelled like library dust, visited the cathedral in November. Theo had mentioned the sun tube in his archive notes, careful not to include anything about doorways or time. Clara measured everything: the tube's diameter, its angle relative to true north, the precision of the chisel marks on the analemma floor. "Extraordinary," she said, kneeling beside the figure 8. "This is 13th century work at least, possibly earlier. The monks here must have been accomplished astronomers. Do you know if there are any records of who maintained it?" Arya thought of Magdalena, of Brother Andres, of the countless caretakers who had chalked and erased and chalked again. "I think it changed hands a lot. Pity. This kind of solar calendar is rare. Most were destroyed during the Reformation, seen as pagan or heretical." Clara ran her finger along one of the ticks. The analemma itself wasn't formally described until the 1600s, but clearly someone here understood the sun's declination and the equation of time centuries earlier. "What's it for?" Theo asked, playing ignorant. "Originally? Agricultural timing, probably. Planting dates, harvest schedules. Later it might have been used for determining liturgical dates, Easter calculations, that sort of thing." She stood, dusting salt from her knees. "But there's something odd. See how some ticks are deeper than others? And this residue in the seams." Arya's throat tightened. "Residue? Calcium carbonate, mostly. Chalk. Someone's been drawing on this recently. Within the last year, I'd say." Clara smiled. "Don't worry, I'm not the site police, but whoever's doing it should use a softer medium. Chalk can scratch the halite over time." When Clara left, Arya and Theo sat in the chamber's dimness. The noon beam had come and gone. Above them, winter clouds turned the sun tube grey. "She's right," Arya said quietly. "Every time I chalk it, I'm wearing it down. Another 100 years of travellers and the marks will be illegible. The dial will stop working. Maybe that's the point." Theo adjusted his glasses. "Maybe it's supposed to have a lifespan. Things aren't meant to last forever. My mum used to say that, about fossils." Arya drew her knees to her chest. "She'd find these perfect specimens, imprints millions of years old, and she'd say they were temporary. Everything's temporary. Even rocks. Even salt cathedrals. Even salt cathedrals." They sat in silence. Somewhere above, a raven called, and the sound echoed down the sun tube like a voice from another world. December brought snow and short days. The noon beam arrived at a steep angle now, striking the winter loop of the analemma, the Hiem section that marked the sun's low arc. Arya came less often. School demanded attention. Finals, college applications, the ordinary machinery of moving forward. But the salt objects on her shelf remained, a small museum of what she'd traded for knowledge. On the winter solstice, Theo called her. "You should come to the cathedral now." She found him there at 11:30, setting up his gnomon in the cold chamber. His breath made clouds. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But look." He pointed at the floor. The noon beam, when it came, would strike the lowest point of the winter loop, the solstice mark, the deepest tick. They waited. At 11:58, the beam descended through the sun tube, narrower than in summer, sharp as a blade. It touched the crystal Theo had placed on the solstice mark, and the brine seams flickered just for a moment. Not the full ignition Arya remembered, but a pulse, a heartbeat. "It knows," Theo said. "The dial knows when it's at a turning point. Solstice, equinox, the nodes of the year." Arya knelt beside the crystal. She could feel it, the potential humming in the floor, the doorway almost forming, one piece of chalk, one clean line connecting to the mark, and she could step into December 21st, of any year the dial remembered. She didn't draw. Instead, she picked up the crystal and held it to the light. Through its facets, the chamber multiplied into 1,000 versions of itself, each one slightly different, each one possible. "I'm not going to use it anymore," she said. "Not to travel," Theo nodded. "Okay. But I don't want it sealed either. Dom wants to cap the sun tube, fill in the sinkhole. He's worried about liability, kids getting hurt. So what do you want?" Arya thought of Brother Andres's note, of the unmarked tick, of leaving the pattern unfinished so it could remain alive, not trapped in salt but breathing with the years. "I want to teach it," she said. "How it works. Not the doorways, nobody needs to know about that, but the astronomy, the way the sun moves, the equation of time." They started small. Theo posted a notice at the library. Solar Observation Group, Tuesdays at the Old Chapel. 3 people came to the first meeting, a retired engineer, a homeschooled kid named Marcus, and a woman who'd grown up in the area and remembered the chapel before the sinkhole. Arya showed them the sun tube, the way the beam tracked across the floor. Theo explained the analemma, drew it on a whiteboard he'd carried down, labelled the loops and ticks. They didn't mention time travel or salt debts or ghost doors. They talked about declination and axial tilt and the way the Earth's elliptical orbit made solar noon drift from clock noon in a figure 8 pattern across the year. Marcus, 12 years old and sharp-eyed, asked if he could make a measurement. Arya gave him her notebook and a pencil. He timed the beam, noted its position, calculated the date based on which tick it struck. He was off by 3 days. The analemma had drifted slightly since it was carved, but his method was sound. By February they had 8 regular members. The retired engineer, whose name was Saul, brought a theodolite and started mapping the chamber's geometry. The homeschooled kid came every week with new questions. They measured, calculated, debated the cathedral's origins. Someone suggested it had been a medieval monastery's secret observatory. Someone else thought it was older, pre-Christian, a Roman surveyor's benchmark. Nobody guessed the truth, and Arya kept it that way. In March, Dom stopped by during one of their sessions. He watched them work, said nothing, then pulled Arya aside. "You're keeping people safe?" "Yes." "And you're not damaging the site?" "No, we're just observing," he grunted. "All right, but I'm putting up better railings at the sinkhole, and if anyone gets hurt, they won't." He left, but the railings went up the following week, along with a sign, "Historical Site, Exercise Caution." It wasn't quite official protection, but it was enough to keep the bureaucrats at bay. April arrived with rain, and the anniversary of Arya's first jump. She descended into the cathedral alone, carrying her chalk and crystal out of habit, but knowing she wouldn't use them. The noon beam struck the floor right where it had a year ago, illuminating the analemma's spring section. She thought about the objects that had returned and the ones that hadn't. Her house key had come back, solid and metal, now hanging on her keychain where it belonged. Her compass worked perfectly, its needle true, but her mother's locket remained salt, delicate and ghostly on her shelf. The photograph inside it was gone forever, or perhaps preserved in some other form. Not in crystal, but in the sharpness of her memory, the way she could still see her mother's face without needing the picture to remind her. The cost had been real. But so had the closing of the circle, the settling of the debt. She had travelled through time, yes, but more importantly she had learned to stop, to let the past be past, to let memory live instead of salting it into relics. Brother Andres had been right. What is saved in salt cannot grow. Arya took out her chalk and knelt beside the analemma. Carefully, precisely, she traced a single mark, not on the figure 8 itself, but beside it, in the margin. A small sigil, a circle with a vertical line through it, the astronomical symbol for Earth, a mark that said I was here, I learned. I chose to leave it unfinished. She rinsed it away at the brine fountain, watching the chalk dissolve into nothing, and climbed back into the afternoon light. That summer, the observation group planned a solstice event. They would track the noon beam on June 21st, the highest point of the analemma, and measure how much the sun tube's angle had shifted since medieval times. Theo built a new gnomon from brass and mahogany. Marcus designed a shadow plotting board. Saul brought a camera with a solar filter. The day came clear and bright. 20 people gathered in the cathedral, crowding the alcoves watching the beam descend. At 12:04 it struck the summer solstice mark, and the chamber filled with murmurs of appreciation. Cameras clicked. Someone took compass readings. Marcus charted the shadow and grinned when his calculations matched Theo's to within 2 minutes of arc. Arya stood at the back watching. None of them knew what the dial could really do. None of them had paid the salt price or seen Magdalena's smile or felt the brine fountain's warmth dissolving their mistakes. They saw only astronomy, beautiful and exact and utterly normal. And that was enough. More than enough. After the group dispersed, Arya stayed behind. The chamber had returned to shadow, the solstice moment past. She sat beside the analemma and thought about cycles, the Earth's long spin, the sun's patient track, the way every year returned to the same marks and yet nothing was ever quite the same. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. Dinner at 6. Trying Mum's lasagna recipe. Wish me luck. She smiled and typed back, I'll bring garlic bread. As she climbed the stairs, she passed the alcove where she'd left her first note, the one addressed to herself from yesterday. The paper was long gone, dissolved by time or taken by some other traveller she'd never meet. But the act of leaving it had mattered. The act of marking time, of saying I was here, of moving forward. At the top of the stairs, Arya turned and looked back down into the dark. The sun tube admitted a slant of late afternoon light, thin and golden, striking nothing in particular, just salt and shadow and the patient ticking of water on stone. She could return tomorrow, next week, next year. The dial would be there, waiting, its pattern worn but legible, its doors ready to open for anyone who learned the rules and paid the price. But for now, she thought, for today, she would go home. She would eat imperfect lasagna with her father. She would finish her college essay about geological time and human memory. She would live in the present, in the moving moment that could never be trapped or salted or held. The past was behind her, preserved not in crystal, but in the person she'd become by travelling through it. And the future waited ahead, unmarked, unmeasured, a blank space on the Annalema where anything might be written. She closed the gate and walked toward the parking lot where Theo was waiting in his car. Through the rear window she could see his cardboard sun model on the back seat, its brass earth bolt catching the light. He waved, she waved back. Above them, the sun tracked westward, moving through its daily arc, tracing its slow figure 8 across the months and years. The dial would mark it faithfully, one noon at a time, whether anyone watched or not. Some things, Arya had learned, were meant to be witnessed, and some things were meant simply to be, patient and permanent and utterly indifferent to human desire. She got in the car. Theo pulled onto the road. The chapel shrank behind them, and the shadows lengthened, and the day moved forward like all days, carrying them with it into whatever came next. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. The old dome stood at the summit like a fractured skull, its copper plating gone green and split along the seams where rain had worked its patience for decades. Maya climbed the last switchback as the sun dropped behind the ridge, her backpack heavy with camera gear and the battered lunar atlas that had belonged to her grandfather. 16 years old and precise in the way of people who photograph stars, she had come for the eclipse, for the clean geometry of shadow-crossing light, for a vantage no floodlit parking lot could offer. The observatory had been abandoned since before her parents were born. Built in the 1890s, when men still believed the heavens could be mapped by hand and eye, it had served one astronomer, Dr. Gideon Hare, whose name appeared in faded gilt on the dedication plaque beside the rusted door. Maya had read about him once in a Historical Society newsletter, a man obsessed with lunar topography who had vanished in 1922 without explanation, leaving only his instruments and a fire-scarred logbook filled with columns of numbers. She pushed through the door. Inside, the dome's interior curved overhead like the inside of a broken egg. Moonlight already slanted through the aperture slit, painting a silver stroke across the floor. The equatorial mount stood at the centre, its brass fittings clouded with verdigris, its telescope long since removed or stolen. But there, beneath a canvas tarp stiff with dust and bird droppings, Maya found something else entirely. A shallow pan, perhaps 3 feet across, set into a brass gimbal that allowed it to tilt and rotate with mechanical precision. The pan's interior was mirror bright, untouched by time, and when she pulled the tarp fully away she saw why. Mercury. A perfect pool of it, thick and luminous, holding the last daylight like molten silver. Around the gimbal's base someone had etched degree markings for altitude and azimuth. A brass alidade lay beside it, its sighting vanes still straight and true. Maya crouched beside the device, careful not to disturb it. Her grandfather had taught her the old ways of celestial navigation, the patient art of measuring angles against the horizon, of consulting tables to find where a celestial body should be at any given moment. This was a selenograph's tool, she realised, an instrument for mapping the moon. But why Mercury? Why a mirror instead of a lens? She opened the logbook she found on a nearby shelf, its leather cover cracked and fire-darkened along one edge. Dr. Hare's handwriting filled the pages, neat columns of dates, lunar phases, altitude and azimuth readings, all annotated with observations. But as she flipped deeper, the entries changed. The scientific precision remained, but the content shifted. Third traversal successful. Observed the Leonids as predicted. Sundial shadow lost upon return. And later, the det grows. Main Street flattens in noon sun. Must find the standstill alignment. And finally, scrawled in a shaking hand, I have become a keeper of what I stole. The dome's penumbra holds me now. Let no one follow this path without understanding the cost. Maya photographed the pages with her phone, then set up her eclipse equipment. But her mind stayed on the mercury pan, on the precise angles carved into its mount, on the logbook's warnings that sounded like madness but read like mathematics. When the moon rose, fat and orange over the eastern hills, she watched its reflection appear in the quicksilver pool, a second moon perfect and depthful, as though the mercury held not a reflection but a window. She should have been setting up her camera. Instead, she found herself consulting the logbook's tables, tracing the numbers against her own ephemeris data. November 15th, 2024. Lunar altitude 18 degrees, azimuth 102. She compared it to an entry from November 15th, 1899. The Leonid meteor shower, a storm of falling stars, altitude and azimuth carefully recorded. The phase matched, waxing gibbous, 78% illuminated. Maya's hands moved before her mind caught up. She adjusted the gimbal, tilting the pan to match the historical altitude, rotating it to the precise azimuth. The moon well, Dr. Hare had called it in his notes. A door, not a mirror, but doors needed keys. She found the vial in a velvet-lined case beneath the logbook, a tiny glass ampule containing a single bead of mercury no larger than a peppercorn. Instructions were etched into the case's lid. Upon the terminator, release the bead. Within the luminous disc, step. Warmth and today's alignment return you. Spill nothing. The moon's reflection in the pan sharpened as she made her final adjustments. It no longer looked like a reflection at all, but like a hole in the Mercury's surface, a well of lunar light reaching down into impossible depth. The terminator, the line between the moon's lit and dark hemispheres, bisected the disk with surgical precision. Maya held the vial above it, her hand steady from years of long exposure photography, and tilted it just enough. The bead fell. It did not sink into the mercury but rolled along the terminator's edge, leaving a faint luminous trail, and stopped exactly at the disk's centre. The reflection deepened further, the moon swelling until it filled the pan's diameter, until Maya could see the shadows of its mountains and the bright rays of its craters with impossible clarity. Light poured upward from the pool, cold and white, painting the dome's interior in shades of silver and ink. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt the same pull she always felt when framing a perfect shot, the sense that something true waited just beyond the shutter's click. Maya placed one foot into the disc. The mercury held her weight like solid glass. She stepped fully in, and the dome fell away. The sensation was not of falling, but of inversion, as though she had stepped through a mirror into the same room, reversed. The dome reformed around her, but the air tasted different now, coal smoke and horse dung and something green and wet that modern air no longer carried. The equatorial mount gleamed with fresh brass and new paint. A telescope, massive and beautiful, pointed skyward through the aperture. And a man stood at a desk sketching lunar features with rapid, confident strokes. Dr. Gideon Hare looked up as Maya emerged from the moonwell's light. He was younger than his photograph suggested, perhaps 40, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that reflected the same silver sheen as the mercury. He did not seem surprised to see her. November 15th, he said, consulting a pocket watch. 1899, you aligned well. The Leonids will begin in approximately 40 minutes. I assume you've come to observe them. Maya's mouth worked soundlessly. The man continued sketching, adding shading to a crater's interior with delicate cross-hatching. Outside, through the dome's aperture, stars burned with a brilliance she'd never seen, unpolluted by electric light, fierce and numberless. I'm Maya, she managed. I found your logbook, the moonwell. Ah, Hare set down his pen. Then you know what it costs. Each traversal takes a shadow from the time you left. Small at first, easily missed. A sundial stripe, a fence post darkness, But the debt compounds, I learned that too late. He gestured toward the window. Look at me in the moonlight. Maya looked. Dr. Hare cast no shadow. Even with the moon pouring light through the dome's opening, even standing directly in its silver flood, he produced no darkness at all. He was a figure of pure light, depthless, wrong. I travelled too often, he said quietly, mapping the moon's libration, chasing meteor showers, recording occultations. Each time I returned, something flattened. Shadows vanished. By the time I understood I had stolen too much, the town below lost its depth. Photographs went flat. Summer turned strange, neither cool nor warm, because shade no longer existed to contrast the light, and I became this. He spread his hands. A keeper of stolen shadows, bound to the penumbra I destroyed. The logbook said something about a standstill alignment, Maya said, a way to return what was taken. Hare's expression shifted, something like hope or hunger crossing his depthless face. The lunar standstill. When the moon reaches its maximum northern or southern declination, its altitude and azimuth at moonrise barely change across years, even decades. Align the moon well to that geometry, spanning multiple nights across time, and you create a channel. Shadows can flow back through it, restored to their proper moments, but it requires perfect precision and more traversals than I had strength left to attempt. Outside, a streak of light crossed the sky, then another, the Leonids beginning their celestial storm. Maya watched through the dome as meteors fell like burning rain, dozens per minute, bright, enough to cast fleeting shadows across the hilltop. Dr. Hare had returned to his sketching, capturing the shower's radiant point with quick, sure lines. She realised that from his perspective she was the ghost, the impossible visitor from a future he would never see. "How do I go back?" she asked. Hare pointed to a spirit lamp on the desk. "Warm the pan gently. The mercury will ripple and break the disc. Realign to your present ephemeris, skim the bead back into its vial across the ripples, and step through before the moon shifts. But be certain of your numbers. An error leaves you stranded." Maya pulled out her phone, shielding its glow. The ephemeris app showed the current moon, her moon, already 10 degrees higher than it had been when she jumped. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the alignment drifted too far. She lit the spirit lamp with matches from Hare's desk and held it beneath the moonwell's base. The mercury shivered. Tiny ripples spread from the centre, fracturing the moon's reflection into dancing fragments. Maya adjusted the gimbal with shaking hands, tilting and rotating until the angle matched her phone's data. The ripples smoothed slightly, and through them she saw not the November sky of 1899, but the familiar light-polluted haze of her own time. She found the bead still resting on the terminator, somehow present in both moments simultaneously, and used a clean glass rod from Hare's equipment to coax it back into the vial. The instant it left the mercury, the disc began to collapse. "Wait!" Hare called out. But Maya was already stepping through, the inverted sensation pulling her forward, and the dome reformed around her once more. Modern again, silent, empty. She checked her phone. 8 minutes had passed in her present. The moon hung exactly where her calculations predicted. Her camera equipment sat undisturbed. The eclipse still 40 minutes away. Everything was precisely as she had left it. Except when she looked out the dome's western window, toward the valley town below, the library's sundial cast no shadow. The moon illuminated it perfectly, a bright circle of stone, but the gnomon produced no darkness at all. The metal post stood there, solid and real, but it threw no shade, created no contrast, existed in a world gone somehow flat. Maya's hands went cold despite the mild November night. She had brought back a photograph of the Leonids, still displayed on her phone screen, shot in a time 125 years gone. She had spoken with a dead man and returned. She had proven that the moonwell worked exactly as the logbook described, and she had stolen a shadow from her own world without meaning to, without understanding, the way a child might pocket something bright without grasping what theft means. She should have left then, should have locked the dome and never returned. But Maya was 16 and precise, and had been raised on the idea that problems had solutions if you measured them, carefully enough. She spent the eclipse documenting the moonwell instead, photographing the mercury pan from every angle, copying the logbook's tables into her own notes, testing the gimbal's range and calibration. When dawn began to grey the eastern sky, She climbed down the hill with a pack full of data and a mind already working through the mathematics of correction. At school the next day, she found Ravi in the makerspace, bent over a breadboard and a tangle of wires. Ravi built instruments the way other people doodled, restless hands always measuring or calibrating or improving something. They had been friends since middle school, bonded by a shared inability to leave broken things broken. "I need an ephemeris calculator," Maya said without preamble, "one that can handle historical dates, parallax correction, atmospheric refraction, and libration, with an interface I can use in the field." Ravi looked up, pushing back safety goggles. "Good morning to you too. Why?" Maya hesitated. The truth sounded insane, but Ravi had never required normal. "I found something at the old observatory, a navigation instrument. I want to test its accuracy." "The place they're about to demolish?" Ravi pulled up a news article on his laptop. Ellery Development submitted their permit last week. They're turning the whole hilltop into luxury condos, groundbreaking in 3 months. Maya felt something tighten in her chest. 3 months to understand the moon well, to master its alignments, to find the standstill solution Dr. Hare had mentioned. 3 months before floodlights and construction crews made precise nighttime observations impossible. "Then I need the calculator soon. Can you build it?" Ravi grinned, the expression of someone handed an interesting problem. "I can have something working by Friday, but I want to see this instrument, and you're buying lunch for a week." Friday came, and Ravi followed Maya up the hill as sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and rose. She had checked the sundial every day that week, documenting its shadowless state, watching as the anomaly spread. By Wednesday, the flagpole outside the post office had joined it, standing bright in afternoon sun but producing no darkness. By Thursday, 3 different streetlights near the library failed to cast pools of shadow beneath them, their light somehow dispersing without contrast. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they dismissed it as a trick of perception, the way eyes adjust and ignore. But Maya's eclipse photographs confirmed it. She had processed them carefully, measuring luminance values, and found that shadow regions in frames taken after her return showed diminished depth, flatter tonal curves, as though something had reached into the image and lifted out the darkness without disturbing anything else. Ravi's reaction to the moonwell was everything Maya had hoped for. He circled it 3 times, examined the gimbal's mechanism, traced the degree markings with one finger, and then sat down hard on the dusty floor and laughed. "This is either an elaborate art installation or the most beautiful navigation instrument I've ever seen. What does it navigate?" "Time," Maya said, and told him everything. The jump to 1899, Dr. Hare's shadowless form, the missing sundial shade. She showed him the logbook, the photographs, the flattened luminance curves. She expected skepticism. Instead, Ravi pulled out his phone and opened the ephemeris app he had built, its interface clean and precise, and began comparing the logbook's tables to calculated lunar positions. "The math checks out," he said after 10 minutes of silence. "Every entry I've tested matches the actual historical ephemeris within 2 arc minutes. That's impossible unless he was actually observing from those nights, or had access to calculation methods that didn't exist yet, or..." He trailed off, staring at the mercury pool. "You really stepped through." "I really did." "And it took the sundial's shadow when you came back?" "Yes." Ravi stood and walked to the moonwell, kneeling beside it the way Maya had, careful and reverent. "Show me how to align it. I need to understand the mechanism before I can help solve this." They spent the next 3 weeks running controlled tests, short jumps into the recent past, hours rather than years. Maya would align the moonwell to 3 nights ago, drop the bead, step through for exactly 5 minutes by her phone's timer, and return using Ravi's app to ensure precise realignment. Each test worked perfectly. Each test also extracted a cost. After a jump to Monday to observe a particularly clear moonrise, a section of the school's courtyard lost its shadow at noon. After a hop to the previous Friday, Ravi's own silhouette began to thin at the edges, its darkness turning grey and uncertain. They documented everything meticulously, photographing each new shadowless region, mapping the spread, searching for patterns. The stolen shadows seemed to follow lines of connection, relationships between the time they visited and the places or people they interacted with, however briefly. "It's like a debt," Ravi said, studying a spectrogram of his own thinning shadow. The Moonwell lets you borrow time, but time demands repayment. Every moment you spend in the past is a moment of contrast removed from the present. Light and shadow, past and future, it's all balanced. Maya thought of Dr. Hare, trapped in the dome's penumbra, a man who had borrowed too much and could never repay. He mentioned a standstill alignment, a way to restore what's taken, but I don't fully understand the geometry yet. They were still researching lunar standstills, still testing short hops and measuring their costs, when Ms. Ellery's construction crew arrived. The floodlights went up on a Tuesday, massive fixtures on portable towers, bright enough to turn midnight into noon. The developer herself came to supervise their placement, a severe woman in an immaculate suit who regarded the dome the way someone might look at a rotten tooth waiting for extraction. "Heritage site," she said, when Maya tried to explain the observatory's historical value. "I've seen the records. One astronomer, no notable discoveries, abandoned for a century. The land's worth more than the history. Those lights stay on for the survey work, and in 3 months, this whole hill gets graded. Find a different place to stargaze." The floodlights ruined everything. They washed out the faint lunar illumination needed for precise alignment, created glare that made reading the alidade impossible, and worst of all, they eliminated the darkness necessary for the Moonwell's reflected disk to appear depthful and clear. Maya and Ravi tried working in the brief windows when the construction crew shut down for the night, but the lights ran on automatic timers, blazing back to life at seemingly random intervals. "We need to map the timer pattern," Ravi said, pulling out a notebook. "Find the dark gaps and work within them. It's the only way we'll have enough time to attempt a standstill alignment." They spent 2 weeks documenting the floodlight schedule, discovering that the system cycled through 20-minute dark periods every 2 hours between midnight and 4 in the morning. Not long, but possibly enough if they were fast and precise. Maya used the time to study Dr. Hare's later logbook entries, the increasingly frantic notes about shadow debt and restoration. The standstill alignment appeared again and again, described in fragments. "Maximum declination," one entry read. "Northern standstill approaches. Must align across keystone nights. Fire, Leonid's, threshold, in single sequence. Meridian line channels the return. Dawn timing critical, but strength fails. The dome holds me now." Maya traced the fire reference back through earlier pages and found it. March 7th, 1919. A blaze had destroyed part of the dome, consuming stored records and nearly killing Dr. Hare himself. He had barely escaped with the logbook and his lunar plates. After the fire, his entries became more erratic, less focused on pure observation and more on the mechanics of temporal travel. An idea formed, reckless and careful at once. If she could jump to March 6th, 1919, the night before the fire, she might prevent it entirely. Save the records, preserve the archives. It would be a large change, a significant intervention, but surely saving knowledge was worth the cost. She did not tell Ravi her plan. The next night, during a dark gap between floodlight cycles, she climbed to the dome alone. The ephemeris for March 6th, 1919 showed a waxing crescent moon, altitude 23 degrees, azimuth 95. She lined the Moonwell with hands that had learned its rhythms, dropped the bead, and stepped through before doubt could stop her. The dome materialized around her, younger by a century, lit by oil, lamps and the thin crescent moon. Dr. Hare sat at his desk, older now than when she'd seen him during the Leonids, his face lined with exhaustion, his shadowless form almost translucent in the lamplight. He looked up as she arrived and sighed, a sound carrying the weight of too much knowledge. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This is the night before the fire. I know because I've tried to prevent it myself 6 times. Each attempt extracted a greater cost and the fire always finds a way. The archives burn because I left a lamp too close to my papers while making an observation. Simple carelessness. No malice, no grand drama, just human error compounded by exhaustion." "Then I'll move the lamp," Maya said. "I'll stay awake with you, keep watch." "And what will you pay?" Hare's voice was gentle but firm. "This is not a small change. These archives, once saved, alter the entire thread of preservation and scholarship. You will owe a significant shadow debt, one that may claim more than you're willing to lose." Maya thought of the sundial, the flagpole, Ravi's thinning silhouette. Then she thought of the knowledge about to be lost. the careful observations and hand-drawn lunar maps. Show me where the lamp goes. I'll be careful. They worked through the night together, Maya keeping the oil lamp safely distant from the papers, while Hare completed his observations. When dawn began to grey the sky, he helped her realign the moonwell for her return, his movements practised and sorrowful. "The debt will come due," he said, as she skimmed the bead back into the vial. "Choose carefully what you're willing to pay." Maya stepped through and emerged into her own time. The dome looked different immediately, better preserved, less fire-scarred. She checked her phone and found new historical articles about the Hare collection, a significant archive of lunar observations and 19th century astronomical equipment, preserved by unknown means and later donated to the State University. Her intervention had worked. But when she descended the hill and walked into town as morning light strengthened, she saw what it had cost. Main Street, the central thoroughfare with its shops and cafes and centuries-old brick facades, cast no shadows at all. None. People walked without silhouettes. Cars moved in bright continuous light. Awnings produced no shade. The entire street existed in a world without depth, flat and strange and wrong. She stood at the corner, watching her own parents walk past the bakery, and saw that they threw no darkness either, their forms bright and depthless in the morning sun. Maya ran back up the hill, her breath harsh in her throat, and found Ravi waiting in the dome. He looked pale, translucent around the edges, as though his substance had thinned during the night. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "My shadow's almost gone. I woke up this morning and barely saw it, even in direct sunlight, and Main Street looks like a photograph someone, overexposed, all light and no contrast," she told him. The fire, the archives, her choice to intervene. Ravi listened without interrupting, then sat down heavily beside the moonwell. "We have to fix this. The standstill alignment. We need to figure it out before the debt spreads further, before there are no shadows left at all." They studied the logbook together, cross-referencing Dr. Hare's cryptic notes with lunar cycle data and the observatory's meridian line, a strip of polished marble set into the floor that marked true north-south. The standstill, they learned, occurred approximately every 18.6 years, when the moon's orbital inclination reached its maximum. During these periods, the moon's altitude at rise and set varied minimally across multiple years, creating a kind of temporal resonance. "If we align the moon well during a standstill," Ravi said, sketching the geometry, "and open doors to multiple keystone moments simultaneously, we create a channel. The meridian line acts as a conduit. Shadows that were extracted can flow back through it, restored to their proper times and places. But it requires perfect precision across several alignments in rapid sequence, and we'd need to do it all during a single dark gap before the floodlights cycle back on." "Can your app calculate the sequence?" Maya asked. "Already working on it. But Maya, there's a problem. The next northern standstill peaks in 8 days, and according to these notes, the alignment window is vanishingly small, maybe 90 seconds. If we mistime it, if the floodlights come on, if clouds roll in, we have to try." They prepared obsessively. Ravi built a portable spirit lamp with precise temperature control and modified the alidade to include electronic-level readouts, accurate to 1/10 of a degree. Maya photographed every inch of the dome and memorized the meridian line's orientation. They mapped the floodlight timer down to the second and identified a 23-minute dark gap starting at 2:47 in the morning of the standstill date. It would have to be enough. Ms. Ellery's crew advanced their timeline. On the 5th day of preparation, a surveyor appeared at the dome with eviction paperwork and a firm deadline. 3 days, he said. "After that, this structure is coming down whether you're in it or not. Developer's orders, clear your things and stay off the property." Maya and Ravi ignored him. They had no intention of leaving before the standstill, and after that either the dome would matter in new ways or nothing would matter at all. On the night of the alignment, they arrived 2 hours early and began setting up. Ravi had programmed his app with a sequence that would guide Maya through 3 precise angles in 90 seconds. The March Fire Night, the November Leonids, and a third date Maya had discovered in the logbook's margins, June 21st, 1997, noted only as threshold family plate critical. "What's the 97 date about?" Ravi asked as they calibrated the gimbal. I don't know yet, but Hare marked it as critical, and it appears in his calculations for the standstill channel. We need all 3 doors opened simultaneously for the shadows to find their way back. At 2:47 precisely, the floodlights died. Darkness rushed in like water filling a hole, and overhead the moon hung at its maximum northern declination, as high as it would climb all year. Maya aligned the moonwell to the first angle, March 1919, and dropped the bead. The disc opened, depthful and luminous. She moved immediately to the second alignment, November 1899, and used a second bead from a cache she'd found in Dr. Hare's equipment. Another door opened, the 2 discs somehow occupying the same space, overlapping, creating a double exposed reflection of 2 moons, 2 nights. Ravi called out time warnings. 60 seconds to floodlights. You need the 3rd door. Maya's hands flew across the controls, adjusting altitude and azimuth for June 97. The app showed the angles, but something felt wrong, off by some factor she could not name. She compensated by instinct, by the feel of the gimbal under her hands, and dropped the 3rd bead. The disc shivered, and 3 moons appeared in the mercury, 3 nights layered like transparencies. Light poured up from the moonwell in a column that painted the dome's interior in impossible silver. Through the layered discs, Maya saw Dr. Hare standing at his desk in the March night, watching her with sorrowful pride. She saw the Leonids falling like rain in November 1899, and through the June door she saw herself, not her present self, but a child, perhaps 6 years old, standing in the dome with her grandfather. This was the threshold night, she realised. The night he'd brought her here for the first time, told her about stars and precision, and the patient work of measuring heavens. The memory had faded over years, but seeing it through the moonwell brought it back sharp and whole. Her grandfather had been photographing the summer moon, teaching her to frame shots, to wait for moments of perfect clarity. He had found something that night, she remembered now. Found the moonwell under its tarp and shown her the mercury, let her watch the moon's reflection without understanding what else the instrument could do. A photographic plate had fallen behind the moonwell's mount, one of Dr. Hare's original lunar maps. Her grandfather had retrieved it, excited by the discovery, meaning to bring it to a museum. But he had died that winter, and the plate, wherever it had ended up, was lost. 30 seconds, Ravi called. The meridian line began to glow, a strip of luminous marble running north-south across the dome floor. Maya watched as darkness flowed down it like liquid, like ink pouring from the moonwell's column of light. Shadows returned along its path, pooling at specific points, before spreading outward. The sundial's shades snapped back into being. The flagpole's darkness reformed. Main Street's depth returned, its buildings regaining contrast and weight. Ravi's silhouette solidified beside her, his substance restored. But the column of light began to pulse, and through it Maya heard Dr. Hare's voice, somehow carried across a century. Stay with me in this perfect night. No more debts, no more losses. The standstill holds all moments equally. You need never return to a world that changes and fades. Stay here in the light, where everything remains precisely as it was. The temptation was real, and cold, and bright. Maya had spent weeks paying for her mistakes, watching shadows vanish because she had been careless, reckless, too eager to fix things she barely understood. How much easier to step into the perfect preservation of the past, to exist in a moment calculated and controlled, where precision meant safety and nothing ever surprised or disappointed or died. 15 seconds, Ravi said, his voice tight with worry. Maya, the realignment. You need to come back now. She looked at the child in the June disk, the version of herself that did not yet know grief or loss, still held safe in her grandfather's patience and love. Then she looked at Ravi, solid and real and present, his shadow firm and dark on the floor, where moments ago it had been dissolving. She thought of her parents on Main Street, walking in proper sunlight with proper shadows, depth and contrast, and all the complicated beauty of a world that insisted on changing. Maya reached for the spirit lamp and lit it, holding the flame under the moonwell's base. The mercury shivered, ripples spreading from centre to edge. The 3 moons wavered and began to collapse. She adjusted the gimbal to her present ephemeris, the angles Ravi's app showed for this exact moment, 2:51 in the morning, standstill peak. The discs compressed toward each other, the light column fracturing into bands. "Now," Ravi shouted, and Maya used the glass rod to skim all 3 beads back into their vial in a single sweeping motion. The beads rolled across the rippled mercury, tracing luminous paths, and with each pass a band of shadow snapped back down the meridian line, flowing out through the dome's open door, racing down the hill toward the town. She saw the library sundial catch its full darkness. She saw the streetlights bloom proper pools of shade. She saw Ravi's form settle fully into depth and weight. The floodlights blazed back to life, harsh and flat and modern. The moonwell went dark, just a pan of liquid metal now, reflecting only the dome's cracked ceiling. Maya collapsed beside it, exhausted and whole. Outside, dawn began to grey the eastern sky, and she knew with the certainty of good measurement that every shadow had returned to its proper place and time. The debt was paid. Dr. Hare's form appeared one last time, translucent in the corner of the dome, no longer trapped but simply visiting, the way ghosts visit places they loved and lost. He smiled, nodded once, and faded. Later, when Maya opened the logbook to record what they had done, she found a new entry in his handwriting despite the page being blank moments before. "Depth requires cost. Thank you for paying yours. The plate is in the West Archive box, 3rd from the mount. Use it well." They found the box where Hare's note indicated, and inside, carefully wrapped, her grandfather's lost photographic plate. A map of the moon's North Polar region, annotated in Dr. Hare's hand and her grandfather's both, 2 observers a century apart collaborating through the strange medium of careful measurement and found artifacts. Maya held it up to the dawn light and saw the shadows on the lunar mountains rendered in perfect depth and detail, every crater catching darkness, every peak throwing shade, light and contrast working together to reveal the truth of distant landscapes. 3 days later, when Ms. Ellery's crew arrived for demolition, they found representatives from the State Historical Society and a county heritage inspector waiting with an emergency preservation order. The Hare Collection archives, their value suddenly recognised, had triggered a review of the entire site. The dome would be stabilised, the instruments conserved, the logbook studied. The luxury condos would have to find another hilltop. Maya and Ravi stood outside the dome as the construction crew packed up their floodlights, the dark gaps in their schedule now permanent. Ravi nudged her shoulder. "So what do we do with a moonwell once we've saved it?" "Lock the beads away," Maya said. "Document everything for whoever comes after us, and maybe exhibit some photographs." She had been working on a series, images from the town taken before and after the shadow restoration, arranged to show the gradual return of depth and contrast. She planned to title it Penumbra, after the partial shadow, the region where light and darkness meet and mingle, where nothing is entirely one thing or another. That evening she climbed back to the dome alone, carrying the lunar atlas that had belonged to her grandfather. She sat beside the moonwell as the moon rose, its reflection appearing in the mercury without depth or invitation, now that no bead marked the terminator. Just a reflection, perfectly ordinary, perfectly beautiful. The observatory had taught her something about precision, about measuring carefully and accepting costs, about understanding that every intervention, every jump, every attempt to fix the past extracted payment from the present. But it had also taught her that some debts were worth paying, that shadows gave meaning to light, and that the richest detail in any photograph lived not in the bright highlights, but in the dark places where depth and mystery and truth gathered like water in a well. She opened the atlas to a page marked with her grandfather's handwriting, a note she had never noticed before. Precision is not about being right. It's about knowing how wrong you might be and measuring carefully anyway. Maya locked the vial of mercury beads in the archive box beside Dr. Hare's logbook, then walked down the hill. The stars began to appear overhead, numberless and burning, each one throwing its ancient light across distances too vast for easy measure. Behind her, the dome stood dark and whole against the sky, keeping its instruments and secrets for whoever might need them next, for whatever future moment demanded the kind of careful measurement that changes worlds. The town below had settled into its restored shadows, the sundial marking hours again, the streetlights casting proper pools of darkness, Main Street holding its depth and weight through the cooling autumn evenings. No one spoke about the weeks when shadows had thinned and vanished, the way no one speaks of dreams that fade upon waking. The flatness had passed like an illness, and people returned to their lives without quite remembering what had been lost, or why its return felt like breathing after holding your breath too long. But Maya remembered. She carried the knowledge the way Dr. Hare had carried it, written in measurements and warnings, preserved in careful documentation for those who might follow the same path. She understood now why he had filled the logbook with such precise detail, why every traversal had been noted with date and cost, why his final entries read like prayers and equations combined. He had been leaving breadcrumbs for whoever found the Moonwell next, trying to spare them the learning curve that had cost him his substance and his freedom. She thought of him often in the weeks that followed, the shadowless astronomer trapped in the dome's penumbra, neither fully present nor fully absent, bound to the place where he had stolen too much time. His final appearance during the standstill alignment had seemed different, though, lighter somehow, as though the restoration of shadows had freed him as well. Perhaps paying the debt worked both ways, releasing creditor and debtor alike from the weight of what was owed. Ravi finished his ephemeris app and released it as open-source software, though he buried the parallax and libration calculations so deep in the documentation that only someone specifically seeking time-travel geometry would recognise their purpose. They never spoke directly about what the app could enable, but they both knew it was there, a tool waiting for the next person who found themselves standing before a mercury mirror, wondering about doors and keys and costs. The Historical Society's preservation of the dome moved quickly once bureaucracy recognised the value of Dr. Hare's archives. Workers stabilised the structure, replaced broken panes in the aperture, cleaned and catalogued the instruments. They found the Moonwell, of course, and debated its purpose. Some called it a selenographic mirror, used for tracking lunar features. Others suggested it was an early attempt at liquid mirror telescope technology. No one guessed its true function, and Maya did not enlighten them. Some knowledge needed to be discovered rather than given, earned through the patient work of alignment and measurement and costly mistakes. She did donate the photographic plate her grandfather had found, the one showing the moon's north polar region, with annotations from 2 different eras. The Historical Society displayed it alongside Dr. Hare's other lunar maps, noting the unusual collaborative nature of the observations, but unable to explain how a photograph from the 1890s contained marginalia in her grandfather's 21st century handwriting. Maya smiled at the placard's careful phrasing. Provenance uncertain. Further research required. Winter came to the valley, and with it the long nights that astronomers love. Maya returned to the dome regularly, sometimes with Ravi, sometimes alone, always with cameras and the lunar atlas and a growing portfolio of shadow work. She photographed the sundial at every hour, documenting how its gnomon shades swept across the stone face, marking time through the patient geometry of light and darkness. She captured the streetlights' pools of shadow, the way they overlapped and blended on snowy evenings. She framed shots of people walking through crosswalks, their silhouettes stretching long in morning light, compressed tight at noon, vanishing at dusk. The exhibition opened in March, on the anniversary of the fire that had almost destroyed the archives, though only Maya and Ravi understood the significance of the date. She called it Penumbra, Studies in Depth and Cost, and filled the gallery with paired images showing the same scenes before and after shadow restoration. Most viewers saw them as artistic studies in contrast and light. A few, those who had lived through the shadowless weeks without quite remembering them, stood before the photographs with expressions of recognition and unease, as though the images touched some half-forgotten dream. One elderly woman spent 20 minutes before a photograph of Main Street, studying the deep shadows cast by awnings and lampposts and walking figures. "It wasn't always like this," she said to Maya, who happened to be standing nearby. "Was it? I remember a time when everything looked flat, overexposed, like a photograph with the contrast turned down. But that doesn't make sense. Shadows don't just disappear." "No," Maya agreed carefully, "they don't. But sometimes we stop seeing them, stop noticing the way they give depth to things, make them real and solid. This series is about learning to see that depth again, about understanding what we'd lose if shadows were gone." The woman nodded slowly, still studying the image. "My husband died last winter. For weeks after, I couldn't see properly. The world looked flat to me, like someone had reached in and removed all the dimension, left only the bright surfaces. I thought it was grief doing that, changing my vision. But maybe it was something else. Maybe the world really did go flat for a while. Maya felt her throat tighten. She had not considered that the shadow debt might affect perception as well as reality, that people might feel the absence even if they could not name or remember it clearly. "I'm sorry about your husband," she said, "but I think the depth came back. I think things are solid again now." "Yes," the woman said. "Yes, they are. Thank you for these photographs. They help me remember that shadows matter, that they're not just absence but presence. The shape of darkness tells you as much as the shape of light." After she left, Ravi appeared at Maya's elbow. "That was heavy," he said quietly. "You okay?" "I'm fine, just thinking about costs." Maya gestured at the photographs lining the gallery walls. "We paid the shadow debt, restored what was taken, but people still felt it while it was gone, even if they couldn't articulate why the world seemed wrong. That's a kind of cost too, the psychological weight of living in a flattened world." Dr. Hare wrote about it in his later entries, how the town changed in subtle ways as shadows vanished. People became more isolated, less connected. Photographs stopped selling at the local shop because they looked wrong, too bright, too empty. Marriages fell apart because partners couldn't see the depth in each other anymore. "But we fixed it," Ravi said. "The standstill alignment worked. Everything came back. This time. But what if someone finds the moon well again? Someone who doesn't read the logbook carefully or doesn't understand the costs until it's too late? What if they think they can travel freely, fix everything they regret, save everyone they've lost, and only realise what they've done when their whole world has gone flat?" Ravi was quiet for a moment, looking at the photographs. "That's why you're exhibiting these, not just as art, but as warning. Documentation of what happens when shadows disappear, and celebration of what it means when they return, both at once." Maya pointed to her favourite image in the series, a shot of the observatory dome at sunset, its curved shadows stretching long across the hilltop, the meridian line visible through the open door as a strip of white marble bisecting the darker interior. Depth requires contrast. Light needs shadow. Time needs both past and present, held in balance. The Moonwell taught us that, but most people will never stand beside it, never drop a bead on the Terminator, never step through into another night. This exhibition is for them, the ones who'll never travel but still need to understand what time costs and why shadows matter. The show ran for 6 weeks and drew more attention than Maya had expected. A photography magazine interviewed her about the technical aspects of capturing shadow detail. An astronomy blog featured her work alongside a historical piece about Dr. Hare and the newly preserved observatory. The local newspaper ran a story connecting the exhibition to the heritage site designation that had saved the dome from demolition. Through it all, Maya spoke carefully about light and darkness, about preservation and cost, about the patient work of seeing truly, but she never mentioned Mercury or traversals or the weeks when the town's shadows had vanished like breath from glass. Only once did someone ask directly. A young man, maybe 20, studying computer science at the State University, stood before the paired images of Main Street and said, "These were taken weeks apart, but the sun angle is identical. Same time of day, same season. How did the shadows change so much between frames? It's like you photographed 2 different realities." Maya met his eyes and saw recognition there, the sharp attention of someone who had noticed something impossible and wanted to understand it. "Sometimes reality shifts," she said carefully. "Sometimes the world loses depth and has to be restored, piece by piece, shadow by shadow. If you're interested in how that works, there's a logbook in the observatory archives. It's publicly accessible now, part of the Hare collection. Look for the entries from 1919 onward. They're written in the language of astronomy, but if you read carefully, they're about something else entirely." The young man nodded slowly. "Time travel," he said, so quietly that no one else could hear. "That's what this is really about. The observatory, the instruments, the missing shadows. Someone found a way to move through time, and it cost them something, cost the whole town something." "If someone had found that," Maya said, matching his quiet tone, "and if they had learned what it cost, and if they had managed to restore what was taken, what would you say to them?" He thought about that for a long moment, studying the photographs with new understanding. "I'd say thank you for paying the debt, and I'd say be careful who else you tell. Not everyone should have access to that kind of power, even if they think they'd use it wisely, especially if they think they'd use it wisely. Good answer, Maya said. The logbook is there if you need it, but read all of it before you make any decisions. Understand the full cost before you consider paying it. Will do. He handed her a business card with his university email. If you ever want to talk about astronomical instruments and their unusual applications, let me know. I'm good with temporal mathematics and ethical frameworks. Might be useful if anyone needs to calculate, say, the long-term consequences of specific observational choices. Maya pocketed the card, recognizing an ally when she met one. The knowledge would spread this way, carefully and slowly, passing between people who understood precision and cost, who would approach the Moonwell with respect rather than casual curiosity. Dr. Hare's legacy, preserved not just in archives but in the careful transmission of understanding from one generation to the next. Spring arrived with longer days and shorter nights, the moon's phases cycling through their eternal rhythm, waxing and waning and waxing again. Maya graduated high school with a portfolio strong enough to earn scholarships, her Penumbra series opening doors to programs that valued technical skill and conceptual depth. Ravi received early admission to engineering school, his ephemeris app cited in the application as evidence of his ability to solve complex interdisciplinary problems. They climbed to the observatory one last time before leaving for college, carrying no cameras or instruments, just themselves and the knowledge they had earned through traversals and costs and the patient work of restoration. The dome stood stable now, its copper plating cleaned and repaired, its interior preserved as historical space. Tourists visited on weekends, guided by docents who explained the equatorial mount and the brass alidade and the curious mercury mirror whose purpose remained officially uncertain. But at night, when the site closed and the tourists departed, the dome returned to its essential silence, moon-washed and patient, waiting for whoever might next understand what it offered and what it demanded. Maya and Ravi sat beside the Moonwell as sunset faded to dusk, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue. The mercury lay still and bright, reflecting the sky without depth or invitation, just liquid metal in a brass pan, nothing more. "Do you ever want to jump again?" Ravi asked. "Now that we know how to manage the costs, how to use the standstill alignment to restore what's taken, we could go anywhere, any night. See the Library of Alexandria before it burned. Watch Shakespeare's first performances. Stand on the beach at Kitty Hawk." Maya thought about that. The temptation of endless nights accessible through precise calculation and careful alignment. "I think about it," she admitted. "But I also think about Dr. Hare, how he started with pure observation and ended trapped in the consequences of his own curiosity. The Moonwell isn't evil or corrupt. It's just powerful, and power always costs something. Maybe the smart thing is to know it exists, to understand how it works, and to use it only when the cost is worth paying, not for curiosity or adventure, but for preservation, for saving things that truly matter. Like the archives from the fire. Like the archives, like knowledge that would otherwise be lost. But not casually, not often, and never without counting the cost first." She touched the vial in her pocket, the mercury beads locked safely away, keys to doors that should remain mostly closed. "We're the keepers now, the way Dr. Hare was. Our job isn't to travel, but to preserve the instrument and the knowledge, to make sure it's here when someone genuinely needs it, and to make sure they understand what they're taking on before they drop a bead and step through." Ravi nodded, looking up at the emerging stars. "The next standstill is in 18 years. If someone needs to restore shadows then, they'll have the logbook and your photographs and my app. They'll have everything we learned, all the mistakes we made and corrected. They won't be starting from nothing the way we did. That's all we can do," Maya said. "Pass on understanding, leave better instructions than we received, hope that whoever comes next is as careful as they are curious." The moon rose, fat and amber over the eastern hills, exactly as it had risen the first night Maya climbed to the dome with her camera and her grandfather's atlas, and no idea what she would find. How long ago that seemed now, though barely 9 months had passed. She had been looking for a clean place to photograph an eclipse, a simple shot of celestial mechanics, light and shadow in their eternal dance. Instead, she had found a door to every night that had ever been, a mirror that reflected not just the moon but time itself, and in using it, in paying its costs, had learned more about depth and measurement and the weight of choices than any textbook could teach. She thought of the woman at her exhibition, the one whose husband had died, who had felt the world go flat in her grief and confusion when the shadows vanished. That was the true cost of the shadow debt, not just the physical absence of darkness, but the emotional weight of living in a world suddenly bereft of depth and solidity. Dr. Hare had noted it in his later entries. Depression rates rising in town, divorce filings increasing, people reporting feelings of unreality and disconnection. When shadows disappeared, more than visual contrast vanished. The sense of substance itself eroded, leaving people adrift in a bright, flat world where nothing seemed quite real. And when the shadows returned during the standstill alignment, that weight had lifted. Not immediately, not for everyone, but gradually, like winter giving way to spring, the world had regained its solidity and depth. The woman's comment about things feeling solid again wasn't metaphorical but literal description. Shadows had come back, and with them, the felt sense of reality, the anchoring weight of darkness that made light meaningful. "We should go," Ravi said, as full dark settled over the hilltop. "The dome closes soon, and I don't want to get locked in. Though I suppose if we did, we'd know how to get out." He grinned, gesturing at the moonwell. Maya smiled back but shook her head. "No casual jumps, remember? We're keepers, not travellers. Besides, I like this time, this present. It's flawed and complicated and full of problems we can't solve by jumping backward. But it's ours, it's real, and it casts proper shadows." They left the dome as the moon climbed higher, its light painting the hillside silver and black, every tree and stone throwing perfect darkness. Maya looked back once at the observatory, its dome silhouetted against the starfield, its shadow, pooling dark at its base, and felt a deep sense of rightness. The moonwell waited within, patient and powerful, ready for the next person who needed it badly enough to pay its costs. But for now, tonight, this moment, Maya had paid her debts and learned her lessons and earned the right to walk forward into the future rather than sideways through the past. Behind them, inside the dome, the mercury lay still as glass, reflecting nothing but the slow wheel of stars and the patient moon that had witnessed every human night since the first fires burned and cast their small defiant shadows against the darkness of the world. The moonwell remembered Dr. Hare and his obsessive mapping, remembered Maya and Ravi and their costly restoration, and would remember whoever came next, whenever they came, however they used the instrument that could open any night like a door if you measured carefully enough and understood what you were willing to pay. Depth requires contrast. Light needs shadow. Time demands both past and present held in careful balance, neither one consuming the other, both existing in their proper places, casting their proper shades. The moonwell taught that lesson to everyone who used it, carved the understanding into their bones through the weight of shadow debts paid and restored. And those who learned it well, who understood the true cost of traversal, became not travellers but keepers, guardians of the instrument and the knowledge, standing watch over a power that could reshape worlds for anyone who had the precision to align it and the wisdom to know when that precision was worth the price it would extract. Maya descended the hill with Ravi beside her, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight, solid and dark and real. The town below glittered with lights, and the spaces between lights, brightness and darkness working together to give the valley its depth and substance. Everything was as it should be, balanced and whole, each shadow in its proper place, each light casting its proper darkness. The debt was paid, the world was restored, and the moonwell waited, patient and precise. For the next night someone needed to open a door through time, and was prepared to pay the cost of stepping through. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.